The Meaning of Psychoanalysis, a book by Martin W. Peck, M.D., 1930 copyright. The Meaning of Psychoanalysis. Significant among the influences affecting present-day thought is the psychology of Sigmund Freud, called psychoanalysis. How far the psychology is cause or product of a changing age is perhaps a question, but certainly, once established, it has taken an important place in the 20th century revolution of thinking. Freudian psychology, so upsetting to the old belief and so fruitful in contribution to the new, is complex and intricate, indeed in its wider aspects, but the nucleus of it can be simply stated. It consists in recognition of the unconscious mental activity. Freud discovered the unconscious mind. The fact that this statement is not literally true changes its significance not at all. While unconscious mentality was recognized before the time of Freud, it was only in the penetrating glimpse of some philosopher prophet or as sort of museum specimen in the psychological laboratory by which some strange anomaly of thought or behavior could be explained. The doctrine of an unconscious mind has not gone unchallenged, and that from authoritative sources. Some in high places have contended that mind implies consciousness, and therefore an unconscious mind is a contradiction in terms. A thesis which of course begs the question and prohibits discussion. On the whole, the array of opposition, formidable at first, has progressively decreased. To avoid unnecessary dispute and tedious exposition, one may accept the concept of an unconscious mental life as the working hypothesis constructed for a legitimate purpose analogous to certain chemical theories and newer hypotheses in physics. Like them, this hypothesis is justified by its plausibility and its usefulness in contributing to a deeper understanding of the human psyche. As a matter of fact, some satisfactory proof of the existence of unconscious mentation is not lacking. Certain psychological experiments, in particular those connected with post-hypnotic suggestion, have an objective accuracy, and in that respect contrast with other of the tenets of psychoanalysis which quite frankly are beyond the reach of proof or disproof. Psychoanalysis, then, is a psychology of the unconscious mind. This implies no exclusion or disparagement of consciousness, but is simply a natural consequence of the assumption that much of the most important mental life is unconscious. Of the total mind so conceived, only a thin upper layer, figuratively speaking, rises into the light of consciousness, while the main substance and mass lies quite beyond the reach of self-awareness or ordinary introspection. To understand the human mind by the study of consciousness alone resembles an attempt to learn the structure and content of the ocean depths by the examination of the surface waters. A concept of the unconscious demands something more than a wide extension of what is ordinarily thought of as mind. It necessitates a complete and revolutionary change in point of view about mental functioning in general. Before the days of psychoanalysis, most men naively assumed that if the need arose and they chose to give time and effort enough to the task, they could fathom their own minds, understand their motives, and if what they found did not please them, change themselves by the use of will and reason. To that state of complacency, the new insight into the processes of unconscious mentality has dealt a stunning blow. It must now be admitted, however reluctantly, that no one can understand himself in any deep way by taking thought, nor by any amount of self-directed logic or effort can he modify to an appreciable extent the main tendencies of his mind. The explanation for this helplessness of conscious thinking in the attempt directly to reach the realm of the unconscious is not difficult to grasp. So-called intellect, that is, the logical thought processes of the mind, are those most available and more nearly under control in consciousness. The gradual freeing of intellect from personal prejudice and bias has made possible the development of the objective realities of natural science. It is by the use of the intellect that the mind of man has been able to gain understanding of the external world and progressively harness it for the satisfaction of human needs. The world of the unconscious mental self, on the other hand, has little connection with logical thought except as the latter may be swayed by unconscious instinctual processes. It is in small degree guided or moved by the intellect and is quite immune to direct exploration by such agency. It is, in contrast, activated by primitive human impulse, controlled by feeling values wholly unrelated to intellect, and much less capable of being understood, measured, or directed. Thus, according to the doctrine of psychoanalysis, the psychological home of impulse and feeling is in the unconscious. It would be very wrong, however, to assume that only the primitive and elementary here reside. In this same region are gradually built up the foundations for the ethical standards which act as inner monitor and guide, and are the basis of conscience. In the unconscious mind, then, are located reservoirs of emotion. Here lies the roots and sources of passion and prejudice. Here, in an equal sense, rests the basic structure of principle and ideal. Between this inner self of impulse and emotion and the outside world is located consciousness, in some respects, so to speak, a buffer state separating the instinctive and less socialized tendencies of man from too immediate contact with the realm of stern reality to whose sovereignty those tendencies must conform. In the lower animals, most of these adjustments are made by instinct alone, with the result of rigid uniformity in reaction. Man, on the other hand, is less bound to pattern and has wide latitude of response. For him, consciousness in considerable measure takes the place of instinct. Consciousness tests out the external world and senses its possibilities and demands. In this service, language is available, and with it, logical thinking with its capacity for precision. The highly perfected machinery of consciousness is serviceable mainly for use in relation to the outer universe, which activate it from the region of the unconscious, and the individual is borne forward somewhat helplessly on waves of feeling, mood, and need, which for better or for worse urge him outward and forward to a place in the life of the world. Unconscious mental activity is governed, then, by entirely different laws from those applying to consciousness. Some of these laws are as follows. A. There is no time relation in the unconscious, and entirely other considerations determine cause and effect. For example, psychic situations of the past which could have no basis in reality except during the period of childhood may, under certain conditions, be carried over to later life and as strongly influence the attitude or conduct of the grown man as though he were still confronted by the actual problem of long ago. Simple examples of this are on every hand. A woman of 40 felt a wave of loneliness and sadness whenever the closing of a door separated her from another person, even when little apparent significance was attached to the parting. She recalled her early childhood when, after her mother's death, a governess took charge of a younger brother and herself. The brother, who was in poor health, was the object of the substitute mother's special care and affection. Each night, the door of the girl's bedroom was closed by the governess as she retired to an adjacent apartment, which was shared with the brother. There was a vivid recollection of the timidity and longing felt by the little girl when she was left alone. In this woman's adult reactions could be recognized something more than mere association of ideas and memory. The unsatisfied craving for the maternal love which she lacked as a child remained with her as a persistent need, and although quite unsatisfiable in the adult world, still colored all her relationships with people. Her reaction to the closed-door situation gave dramatic expression in a trivial setting to this childish longing. B. In the unconscious, fantasy is indistinguishable from reality. Impulses, wishes, fears, and so on are reacted to as though already translated into action. In other words, to the unconscious mind, the potential attitude or deed is equivalent to the actual one. To illustrate, may be mentioned the man who consciously has a desire to do injury to a near relative or friend. Concerning this hostile wish, he may feel some humiliation and self-disapproval, but he knows how to control himself and does not unduly upset him. A similar desire, acting unconsciously, may cause an emotional reaction of terror, guilt, and remorse, as though the act were really accomplished. C. There is no such thing as consistency in the unconscious. Entirely contradictory and opposing attitudes can exist side by side without in any way modifying or diminishing each other. This is best seen in human relationships and is well exemplified by the love-hate, so-called ambivalent feeling of many neurotics towards their intimates. Shakespeare calls Brutus to say concerning Caesar, "As Caesar loved me, I weep for him. As he was fortunate, I rejoiced at it. As he was valiant, I honor him. But as he was ambitious, I slew him." Such a division of sentiment in consciousness must be somewhat artificial. It is necessary to have but one of these attitudes at a time. Some sort of unity is demanded, however, momentary and changing. Some sort of unity is demanded, however momentary and changing. In the unconscious, however, no such rule applies, and there is no contradiction when desires exist at the same moment which are incompatible and mutually exclusive. Therefore, in the unconscious at least, it is true that one can honor, love, hate, and murder Caesar simultaneously. D. Finally, in the unconscious, the symbolic competes with the actual and is interchangeable with it in a way that is normally quite foreign to the conscious mind. The significance of the closed door already mentioned will once more illustrate. Consciousness repudiated any important meaning. The unconscious, on the other hand, responded as though the childish experience was being repeated. These and other special characteristics of the unconscious create an Alice in Wonderland inner universe, seemingly illogical, irrational, and fantastic, which, in health, by some kind of integration all its own, furnishes a sound basis for the structure of personality, but when in disorder may, as it were, erupt to the surface in the form of peculiarities of temperament, odd moods, nervous symptoms, and so on, which seem so strange when viewed without knowledge of their origin, that they may bewilder the subject equally with his friends. It is difficult fully to realize the ultimate effect on our culture that may follow the recognition of an unconscious mind with the forces and influences which are operative within it. From the beginning of abstract thought, man has vainly attempted to understand himself and his neighbors by use of the data which consciousness could furnish. Through the development of a special technique for the investigation of mind, psychoanalysis has found a way to penetrate the uncharted depths beneath the surface of consciousness. That findings are often vague and uncertain changes in no whit the enormous significance of this extension of knowledge. A completely new method of approach to problems of thought and behavior is made available. Things of the mental life, hitherto utterly obscure, become increasingly clear and understandable. There is small wonder, perhaps, that certain disciples of the new psychology see visions of a new era in the direction of human progress. The possibilities arising from the application of the psychology of the unconscious are limitless. In early periods, as man slowly struggled towards an appreciation of the world about him, he saw behind the manifestations of nature the directed will of capricious gods. A little knowledge of the physical universe spelled the downfall of the gods, and soon, when the thundercloud appeared, it was recognized as the product of natural forces rather than an expression of the wrath of Jove. Civilized man has reached the place where he reluctantly accepts any limit to his understanding and mastery of the external world, but if forced to turn towards himself, he still stands baffled by the mysteries of his own motives and ideals and is little aware of the inner forces which move him. In dealing with the outer world, of the powers of intellect have developed into tools of scientific precision. It may well be that psychoanalysis marks a first step in turning these same tools towards the exploration and understanding of that inner world of the human mind, till now only left to the realm of mystery or grasped by a type of revelation less and less convincing to the modern temper. Let us apply the psychoanalytic method to a concrete situation, permitting, for the purpose of simplicity, a somewhat free hand. For the experiment, we may select an individual who on political and social matters is a die-hard reactionary, prepared to defend his position. We will introduce him for formal discussion to another individual who in the same field is an equally uncompromising radical with a passion for argument. The result, in the form of a vigorous, wordy battle, is predictable with considerable accuracy. The reactionary will propound his own viewpoints and denounce his opponent. The radical will lay down the law as he sees things and heap opprobrium on his adversary. Each is anathema to the other. At the end of the debate, neither has been in the slightest degree influenced and has listened to his antagonist only sufficiently to gather ammunition for himself. Towards any acceptance of new ideas, his mind is completely closed. All that has been accomplished is that each man has further strengthened opinions already of granite-like consistency. The impartial spectator, if we may stretch fancy to create such a one, listens to the views expounded with such conviction, weighs them somewhat at their face value, and finds himself more bewildered than before. He may recognize some obvious influences at work. The one man perhaps has financial or other interest in established industry. The other is a footloose with nothing to lose. But these things alone do not explain the rigor and intensity of their feelings. To aid in understanding, let us make use of some of the principles of psychoanalytic thought which can be applied to the participants in the recent verbal unpleasantness. Immediately a flood of light is directed into hitherto dark places, and a new valuation of the whole subject becomes possible. It is found that the two men, in their argument and disagreement, were only in part dealing impartially with questions of principle and expediency, but were expressing through the medium of political and social matters their own personal bias. This bias was determined by the life experience and various influences of the past, resulting in the needs and strivings, fears and hopes, which are the motive forces of the present. In other words, their differences were determined more by emotional factors within themselves than by any merits of the questions immediately at issue. These men at heart would be equally far apart on other things, even if there happened to be no actual questions of the hour on which they could disagree. Their opposite points of view have an unconscious basis of which they are totally unaware. These views have been rationalized by bringing to their support reasons which have some measure of validity and can therefore satisfy consciousness, but which are nevertheless mainly screens which conceal the real issues involved. Continuing the second stage of the experiment, let us take the radical to pieces psychologically and find out how he is made. We discover that this belligerent individual, however brilliant in intellect, is struggling emotionally in an adolescent world. In his psychic structure, he has failed to throw off the bonds of authority, which are the lot of the child, but from which the adult must be emancipated if he is to become a free and independent personality. Put in another manner, the radical is still the child fighting his way to independence and self-determination from the bondage of family authority, which would tend to keep him in a state of childish subjection. He has long ago broken away from the actual family. His parents may be dead or living far away, but still within himself he struggles against the domination of authority, as though still a boy in revolt against a stern father. In place of actual persons to whom he is bound in a personal sense are substituted state, church, conventions, established ideas, and so on, all of which appear to him as something dangerous to his freedom and to be treated as enemies. But let not the reactionary exult prematurely at any seeming discomfiture of his opponent. By the demands of the experiment, it is now his turn to be psychologically dissected. It is found that he, too, has never completely grown up and has thus failed to achieve that maturity of personality which gives a capacity for independent thinking. He must lean on something solid and familiar, and in consequence ties himself hard and fast to the tradition of authority and of the past. He resembles his antagonist in that he is still the child who sees in the established order the mighty father, but his reaction is quite the opposite. Instead of defying that authority, he accepts it in return for the security of mind which such acceptance guarantees. And as a corollary, any questioning or doubts for him spells heresy and brings a fear and uncertainty. Less wonder, then, that for other reasons than to protect his stock dividends, the reactionary fights the status quo. To admit any defect loosens the foundation of his rigid philosophy of life, based on authority, and threatens to bring the whole structure tumbling about his ears. Both reactionary and radical are controlled by unresolved attitudes towards the dominating and disciplinary influences of the childhood past from which they have never been able to free themselves. The one is governed by fear and clings to this bulwark of support for protection from dangers which lie mainly within himself. On the other hand, by hate and defiance, and fights stubbornly against the subjection which has no reality except as he lives over again the unfinished struggles for independence incident to childhood relationships which deep in his unconscious maintain an unabated vitality. Such an explanation of the motives determining these different viewpoints is much oversimplified, and it is not necessary to take it too seriously, although there is probability that it contains more than a modicum of truth. The point at issue for the moment is not so much the accuracy of findings in this particular study as the purpose behind it and the methods employed. Psychoanalytic principles and techniques of investigation for the first time open the doors to what is going on below the surface of the human mind. Granted that in the experiment used for illustration, the deep-lying motives are as outlined, or somewhat or even remotely akin, then immediately the whole approach to the problem is changed. If there is desire to understand or modify the views or influence of one or the other of the groups represented, it is clear that of more use than argument or denunciation will be to make plain to the individual and the world the childlike fear and antagonism which is the basis for extreme opinions. Then indeed the scope of consideration will be moved to the plane where it belongs, from shadow towards substance, from smoke towards fire. Insofar as this is accomplished, will the result the possibility of more intelligent appraisal and effective influence. In such manner as exemplified above, the searchlight of psychoanalysis is being turned slowly from one sphere of human interest to another. The study of the mental life of the individual is the main concern from the standpoint of medical psychology. As a development from this primary approach, more general problems have been reached, and history, art, mythology, religion, and so on are given a more clear revealing. But the average man does not find that such social questions, viewed in the large, touch him very closely. The matter of the nervousness in some of these aspects is apt to be of more immediate and vital concern. It is to a discussion of the bearing of psychoanalysis on this problem of everyday interest that the subsequent chapters of this book will be mainly directed. Chapter 2. Sigmund Freud and the History of Psychoanalysis. In outlining the history and development of psychoanalysis from its beginnings to the present day, there is no better method than to review the life of Sigmund Freud, the founder and still the leader of the psychoanalytic school. Whatever fate the future may hold for psychoanalytic doctrine, as now understood and accepted by its followers, there is little doubt that Freud has gained a foremost place among the great world figures in psychological science. This sentiment is voiced by Professor William McDougall with all the greater emphasis for his being in many respects a stern critic of the new psychology. Professor McDougall says, "I believe that Freud has done more for the advancement of psychology than any student since Aristotle. It is rare for any leader in human thought to reveal himself in his writings so completely as has Freud. Psychoanalysis has, in its various phases, has been his constant preoccupation for the last 40 years. The nature of it makes, at least in the early stages, for a particular involvement with the lives of its exponents. For the first decade, Freud worked wholly alone, and the story of psychoanalysis during that period is the story of Freud himself. It would be incorrect to consider that all the novel and revolutionary principles of psychoanalysis originated in the brain of Freud. As is usually true concerning what appears to be new, most of these principles have been touched upon in one way or another before, and no one is more careful than Freud to give credit to other sources, or more ready to resign priority. What he did do was to gather together certain selected truths and isolated observations, and to form a usable structure which made possible the penetration of the hitherto hidden regions of the human mind. By tireless and painstaking endeavor, he gave life to dead germs of psychological fact in a way that has led to an amazing growth and fruitfulness. There seems good reason to agree with those who see exemplified in his work, with few parallels in the history of psychology and medicine, the operation of creative genius. Sigmund Freud was born in 1856 of Jewish parentage. In his early years, the family moved to Vienna, which has been permanently his home and the field of his labors. Although in limited circumstances, the father supported the son's desire for an education and wished him to make his own choice of a profession. Freud disclaims as a youth or later any particular predilection for a career as of a physician. Quote, "I was moved," he says, "rather by a sort of curiosity which was, however, directed more towards human concerns than by human objects." unquote. Entering the university at the age of 17, he met for the first time the full force of the prejudice felt towards the Jews. This affected him strongly, and he was not disposed to accept it with meekness. As to the influence of this discrimination, he comments, "These first impressions at the university had one consequence which was afterward to prove important, for at an early age I was made familiar with the fate of being in the opposition and of being put under the ban of a, quote, compact majority. The foundations were thus laid for a certain degree of independence of judgment. For a number of years preceding a somewhat tardy graduation in medicine, the young student devoted his best energies to investigations in problems of physiology and anatomy of the nervous system in the lower animals. In this field, he achieved some measure of distinction and displayed the qualities of the patient and persistent research worker. Notwithstanding the superstructure of hypotheses and speculation, which consideration of the human mind invites, these same characteristics have been retained in surprising degree in the basic studies of his latter work in psychology. Referring to that period of early interest, he says, I was now developing an inclination to concentrate my work upon a single subject or problem. This inclination has persisted and has since led to my being accused of one-sidedness. Freud well might have remained for all time a physiologist and anatomist, sheltered from the world of human beings by the walls of a laboratory, if practical considerations of earning a livelihood had not turned him towards the actual practice of medicine. In this new clinical field, his interest turned quite naturally to diseases of that nervous system which had been the subject of his laboratory studies. Here again his first concern was with organic disorders, and he gained some reputation as a diagnostician. He was now in his middle 20s, a junior physician in a large general hospital. He states, quote, the fame of my diagnosis and their post-mortem confirmation brought me an influx of American physicians, to whom I lectured on the patients in my department in a sort of pidgin English. I understood nothing about the neuroses. On one occasion, I introduced to my audience a neurotic suffering from persistent headache as a case of chronic localized meningitis. They quite rightly rose in revolt against me, and my premature activities as a teacher came to an end. By way of excuse, I may add that this happened at a time when greater authorities than myself in Vienna were in the habit of diagnosing neurasthenia as a cerebral tumor. Neurasthenia as a cerebral tumor. Shortly after this experience as a lecturer, Freud, in consideration of publications of merit, was awarded a traveling scholarship of considerable value and journeyed to Paris. At the Salpêtrière, the name of Charcot was a beacon light to all student travelers in the realm of nervous disease. Charcot, by the weight of his authority and prestige, had forced a reluctant and disbelieving medical world to accept the fact that the familiar symptoms of hysteria were due to mental and not physical causes. He had proved the geniuses of hysterical phenomena show that they existed in men as well as women, and had demonstrated that hysterical symptoms could be both removed and produced by hypnotic suggestion. After a period in Paris and Berlin clinics, Freud settled in Vienna in 1886 to practice medicine as a specialist in nervous diseases. He was now married, and soon a growing family demanded a lucrative income. In his practice, he had the common experience of neurologists in finding that major part of his clientele was made up of people suffering from hysteria and other neuroses, and learning in organic neurology availed no whit to bring relief. He had gained the principles of hypnotism at the Salpêtrière, supplemented by later work with Bernheim at Nancy. This method, together with physiotherapy, made up his main resources in treatment and functional nervous conditions. Both methods proved unreliable and inadequate in helping many of these nervous patients, a serious matter in a double sense to one who must make his living by treating them. At the same time, Freud's curious and scientifically trained mind was challenged by the complete obscurity surrounding the nature and origin of the neuroses. Charcot, his pupil Janet, and others had done much in both accurate description and the formulation of descriptive hypotheses, but little beyond a few vague theories and old wives' tales had ever been offered to explain causes without which no real understanding could be possible. Having always in mind this matter of causation, Freud from the start made use of hypnotism in a twofold way. First, to remove symptoms by suggestion, and secondly, to gain from the patient some statement as to the origin of these symptoms, which in the waking state could be described only imperfectly or not at all. He felt that this procedure was justified, if for no other purpose than to satisfy his own curiosity about the development of symptoms which he was endeavoring to remove. This use of hypnosis as a means of exploration of the patient's mind, Freud ascribed to the example of Dr. Joseph Breuer, a leading family physician of Vienna, who had told his younger colleague some years before of a stubborn case of hysteria in which this method had been used based on a chance observation, and was a factor contributory to a brilliant cure. Breuer's patient was a young girl of superior intelligence who had become ill after a long period devoted to the nursing of her invalid father. Her symptoms of emotionalism, paralysis, pains, and so on had no meaning to her in the waking state, but under deep hypnosis she was able, in a hallucinatory way, to connect each of them with some incident or group of incidents which had occurred while she was attending the sick father. The incidents were occasion for strong emotion, which had to be suppressed at the time, and the symptoms appeared to be some sort of substitute expression. Armed with this information, Breuer was able to help the girl live through these experiences again in retrospect and give expression to the painful emotions attached to them in a more direct way. By going through this process painstakingly and repeatedly, the symptoms, one by one, disappeared. The patient good-naturedly referred to this process as chimney sweeping and the talking cure. Burdened with the duties of a diversified practice, Breuer had not pursued the matter further at the time and was in a small degree aware of the importance of his observations. Freud's new field of work brought a fresh interest in the account of Breuer's case as it had been given to him originally. He began to apply the same procedure with his own patients and was able to verify the results in a number of cases. He persuaded Breuer to collaborate with him in further investigations, and in 1895 the two published jointly Studies in Hysteria, which gave the results of their findings. In this monograph, a group of cases were outlined, including the original one of Breuer's, to demonstrate that certain hysterical symptoms were the result of vivid and disturbing experiences, highly charged with emotion, which had occurred long before and been completely forgotten. This forgetting was felt by the authors to be a purposeful one, established in order to protect the individual from the mental distress of conscious realization. They were able to show that if the memories could be brought back to consciousness and the painful emotions dispelled by actual discharge, in tears, anger, vituperation, or whatnot, while at the same time by talk with the physician, new points of view were gained when the symptoms would disappear for good. The direct emotional discharge brought about during treatment was termed abreaction. Later on, the direct emotional discharge brought about during treatment was termed abreaction. Later on, Freud gave the name repression to the process of purposeful forgetting. In their first publication, it was asserted that the hysterical patient suffered from reminiscences, that each painful suppressed memory remained in the dark recesses of the mind, acting there as a psychological foreign body, and that the symptom was a disguised and substitute expression of the persistent mental irritation of this foreign body. In the production of the symptom, the transformation of psychic energy from an emotional state to a physical disturbance was called conversion. To repeat, in the production of the symptom of the transformation of psychic energy from an emotional state to physical disturbance was called conversion. Based on these theories, the object of treatment was to bring the hidden psychic foreign bodies to the consciousness and rid them, in one way or another, of their capacity for injury. This process was designated catharsis. It was hoped at the time that the cathartic method would fill the need for a new therapy in the neuroses, although it soon proved not to be the panacea that at first it seemed. In the sense that catharsis was the forerunner of psychoanalysis, the high hopes held out for it were in part fulfilled. While the original observations just outlined were sound and could be generalized within certain limits as a basis for nervous symptoms, the ingenious theory built up upon them proved altogether too simple and was found to apply only to a few uncomplicated types. To repeat, while the original observations just outlined were sound and could be generalized within certain limits as a basis for nervous symptoms, the ingenious theory built up upon them proved altogether too simple and was found to apply only to a few uncomplicated types of disorder, where symptoms were indeed literally substitute expressions for the hidden memory or traumatic experiences. From this relatively simple beginning, however, has been constructed the whole superstructure of psychoanalytic theory and practice, with all its many ramifications in medicine and other fields. Launched in this investigation of the unconscious mind by the work of collaboration with Breuer, Freud went on independently and studied intensively a number of patients. Rapid developments occurred, with resulting modifications of technique and theory. The methods of hypnosis was found in various ways unsatisfactory. For one reason, many people could be put in a hypnotic state only with difficulty or not at all, influenced by a statement of Bernheim that memories available under hypnosis could also be brought back in the waking state if sufficient effort were made. Freud tried the second method and found it equally successful. The procedure was carried out in a setting similar to that used in hypnosis, where the patient on a couch and the physician pressing his hand to the subject's forehead. With repeated reassurance and insistence, it was gradually possible to bring back repressed material and effectively connect up symptoms with the chains of psychological happenings which had produced them. This method had the advantage that patient as well as physician were conscious of all that was going on and could more intelligently profit thereby. While the working with this method of benevolent compulsion in bringing to life repressed memories, the Freud became aware that some substantial obstacle was interposed and that he was struggling against a strong force in the patient's mind which opposed recollection. This opposition appeared to be scarcely less rigorous when the patient gave full conscious cooperation. Freud designated this force of opposition resistance, saw that it operated unconsciously, and felt that it was in some way of the same nature and equivalent in degree to the factors that produced the original repression. As a result of this observation, efforts in treatment came to be more and more directed towards a removal of resistances rather than to a search for causes. Overcoming of resistances then became a central point of the therapeutic process, and in a less narrow and limited form remains so to this day. The forceful method of mental exploration and the resulting modification of content above described were exhausting to both parties and had other drawbacks, so that new means were sought which could accomplish the same purpose. By a combination of chance experiment and theoretical formulation, Freud found that what he called free association furnished a means of investigation of the subject's mind, which had fewer disadvantages and arrived at the same goal as the other. Free association called for passivity on the part of both operator and subject, in contrast to the unnecessary struggle of wills often present in the previous method. The subject was directed to let his mental processes go on with as little conscious direction as possible and to tell everything which passed through his mind, no matter whether it seemed of any importance or whether it was trivial, irrelevant, unpleasant, or disconnected. This plan, which of course depended on the patient's complete cooperation, was found to lead finally by some unconscious thread of connection to the roots of origin of the special difficulties. To this development and modification of the old cathartic method, the name psychoanalysis was given. With this improved technique, it was found that the trail to the source of nervous symptoms penetrated even deeper into the unconscious and further back in the life history of the individual, until it appeared that into the fabric of a fully developed neurosis were woven all the threads which make up the whole structure of the personality. During the step-by-step development of method to which Freud was now devoting his whole time and effort, another discovery was made, which has proved to be the villain in the peace and the stormy petrel of psychoanalysis, around which both medical and non-medical circles, the high tides of controversy, have ebbed and flowed. This discovery and resulting theory connected the part played by the sexual impulses in the neuroses and the place of sexual motive in life in general. These results were based on no a priori assumption on the part of the investigator. On the contrary, in the earlier observations, the sexual life of the patients had not seemed of special importance. Breuer had even commented on the unusual absence of sexual interests and tendencies in his original patient. It appeared, however, as Freud's study progressed, that not all types of mental difficulties were equally transferable into symptoms, but it was chiefly those which had some concern with the sexual function, varying from matters of current conflict in that of to the ruminations, experiments, fantasies of early childhood. These findings both amazed and impressed this pioneer investigator. He began to pay more attention to matters of sex and felt that there was revealed to him a new world lying clearly before his eyes of those who chose to open them and to see, the most astonishing fact that it had so far remained undiscovered. Freud observed that he felt he belonged to those who had disturbed the sleep of the world. The sexual theory of neurosis evolved by Freud from these studies led inevitably to the construction of a normal psychology in which sexual motive played a dominant role. This emphasis on the sexual side of life has been the source of more misunderstanding, more chaos and confusion of mind, more violent denunciation and acrimonious debate than all the other matter of psychoanalysis combined. Too often seen out of perspective, it blots out everything else, as the finger held close before the eyes obscures the sun. Casual and superficial students go no further than to find in psychoanalytic psychology only an elaborate sexology. The association of sex with psychoanalysis has been a lure for the prurient, while to the prudish it has seemed a fire-spitting dragon. The advocates of sexual license strive, and in vain, to find through it a justification for self-indulgent living. Those consecrated to the rigid Puritan morality lay erroneously at its doors the present-day liberalism in sexual thought and behavior. In scientific circles, it has been responsible for some of the more serious differences in the ranks of the psychoanalysts themselves. Through all the storm, Freud has remained steadfast and unshaken, holding to the conclusions to which clinical observations have led him, and to the more general theories which seem to him the necessary and logical developments from them. He has changed his own views in certain respects, frequently and willingly, but only on the basis of evidence which was convincing or new theories which explained facts better than older ones. Never has he conciliated or compromised under pressure of criticism or to appease prejudice. The sexual theories of psychoanalysis will be discussed more in detail in another chapter. Suffice it to say here that, in a broad philosophical sense, Freud sees in procreation and the resulting perpetuation of the species the fundamental aim of animal organisms, including man. To ensure this purpose, instinctive energy is concentrated to an enormous degree in the sexual function, all other functions being secondary and contributory. In humankind, the psychic values of civilization and culture, developed through the ages, interpose barriers across the path of the sexual instincts, which otherwise strive towards the purely primitive biological goal. Blocked to a considerable degree in direct outlet, the energy of these instincts becomes available through sublimation and substitution for attitudes and activities on a more complex level, with the resulting growth of the social, moral, and spiritual qualities which set man apart from the lower animals in a kingdom of his own. Put in other words, in man a large part of procreative energy is transposed into a wider creative energy. These new resources give the capacity for constructing a civilization which, in turn, still further checks and diverts the more elementary animal instincts. Thus, in slow process goes on the gradual evolution of the primitive man from the distant past towards the superman of the still more distant future. Looked at in this general way, Freud's contention must be true. Some of the simplest organisms die in reproduction, their purpose in life accomplished. All along the scale of animal life, less obvious only in degree, is reproduction the aim of major and irresistible forces. In man, the whole physical development from embryo to maturity gives central importance to the reproductive function. It is only in the rich and elaborate psychic life of human beings, the superstructure, so to speak, that this fundamental principle of sexual instinct, diverted and diffused in this realm into new channels, has been lost sight of, to be, in a sense, rediscovered by Freud. But except in the medical and psychological world, Freud holds no priority for this discovery. The poets of all the world and of all ages have preached this doctrine from the housetops. At the other extreme in modern times, the basic biological sciences tacitly accept the same views, but are too far divorced from the real life of the ordinary man to have much meaning or connection with everyday matters. All this novel theory means a widespread and startling extension of the concept of sexuality, tracing back the roots of instinctive disturbances responsible for the neuroses further and further into childhood. Freud formulated the doctrine of infantile sexuality. The sexuality of this period concerns the bodily functions and mental attitudes of the young child. To repeat, the sexuality of this period concerns the body functions and mental attitudes of the young child. Before much in the nature of genital activity can be evidence, and deals with so-called component instincts, the prototypes and prodromals of latter sexuality, as the term is used in the ordinary sense. Briefly, Freud found that the sexual function in very early years was fused and merged with many body functions, such as those of the mouth, the rectum, and others, which for a time take first place for pleasure and interest on the part of the child, and only through a long and complicated process of development reach what is accepted as the normal sexual makeup of the adult. This phase of so-called pregenital sexuality appears to be of enormous significance in relation to the latter character anomalies, neuroses, and sexual perversions. This extension of the concept of sexuality may be summed up in Freud's own words. To quote, "That extension is of a twofold nature. In the first place, sexuality is divorced from its too close connection with the genitals and is regarded as a more comprehensive bodily function, having pleasure as its goal, and only secondarily comes to serve the ends of reproduction. In the second place, the sexual impulses are regarded as including all of those merely affectionate and friendly impulses to which usage applies the exceedingly ambiguous word love. I do not, however, consider that these extensions are innovations, but rather restorations. They signify the removal of inexpedient limitations of the concept into which we allowed ourselves to be led." On the same subject, he continues, to quote, "The second of my alleged extensions of the concept of sexuality finds its justification in the fact revealed by psychoanalytic investigation that all of these affectionate impulses were originally of a completely sexual nature, but have become inhibited in their aim or sublimated. The manner in which the sexual instincts can thus be influenced and diverted enables them to be employed for cultural activities of every kind, to which indeed they bring the most important contributions. Therefore, however difficult it may be to accept or even to grasp Freud's meaning in all this, let it be hoped that enough has been said to show conclusively that sex in psychoanalysis has an enormously broader significance than an exclusive interest in man's sexual passions, or even a special concern in all that is included within the scope of romantic love. The love and passion of adult humans beings are looked upon as end products of multiple and involved psychological factors. These common needs and experiences are an outcropping to the surface of elements which extend far back into the past and far down into the unconscious. In the affairs of men they make up, so to speak, only the swiftly flowing central current in a vast stream which extends to the horizon on either side. Psychoanalysis includes all of these wider and deeper connections to the extended meaning of the term sex." Chapter 3. The History of Psychoanalysis, continued. The previous chapter closed with an outline of Freud's sexual theories, and some of the arguments in support of them was presented. Now what can be brought against them? Among other things, outstandingly this: even if his concepts are correct, and granting the assumption of a materialistic and biological basis for the psychic life of man, they undoubtedly are. The use of the term sex and sexual is bound to arouse in the minds of students and readers something other than what is meant by Freud, and therefore they are not getting the exact truth. The term sex has, from prolonged usage and with a special set of emotional values, accumulated connotations which limit it to the matter of adult genital sexuality, in particular the intimate physical relationship between men and women. Sex to the ordinary person is thought of in a concrete behavioristic way as something to be indulged in or denied, to be desired or to be abhorred, to be looked upon seriously or lightly according to the circumstances, training, moral concepts, and aesthetic standards. Freud demands that the term be extended, that the term be extended to cover other fields and to be used in widely expanded meanings, psychosexual rather than sexual. Put in another way, the ordinary person thinks of sex in the physical sense, while Freud refers equally and more to the purely psychological features, and the unconscious ones at that. For the average man to conceive of unconscious psychic sexuality is as difficult as to think of an unconscious blow on the point of the jaw. His machinery of thought simply is not sufficient for the task. The whole Western world is thoroughly conditioned to a limited and special meaning for the term sex. The task of re-educating to a broader concept seems a difficult and in many ways altogether useless burden to undertake. There is required as much effort in undoing the old as in establishing the new, in tearing down as well as in building up. Certainly one might fervently hope for an inspiration which would lead to devising some convenient concept and terminology, including more easily within its scope both sexually as interpreted by the man on the street and the extended sexuality of Freud. There has been a recent emphasis in psychoanalysis on so-called ego psychology, in contrast to the instinct psychology which received first consideration in study and research. It seems not improbable that in this concept of the ego there will develop much to harmonize the sexual motive in the human psyche which psychoanalysis has revealed, with the idealism and aestheticism which for the average man claim equal recognition and which appear to him in some way nullified by the new psychology. One interesting step in the early groping progress along the path towards the meaning and causation of neurosis illustrates the painstaking attitude of Freud and is an example also of his ground for broadening the scope of the sexual side of life. In hysterical patients, it appeared for a time that the causal chain of symptoms led back to some actual sexual experience of childhood, which could in a very general way be included under the head of seduction with its accompanying emotional shock. Freud felt for a time that here indeed was finally discovered the cause of these conditions. Attempting to confirm the findings by more extensive studies, he found the same story present in cases where it was possible to prove conclusively that nothing of the sort could have happened, and the patient must have fantasized the scene. For the moment he was ready to throw over the whole investigation in disgust at his own credulity, but soon it dawned on him that there was in truth a more important discovery than had been made before. It led him to the belief that these common and similar fantasies had a universal mental reality, even if there was no actual physical experience, that the effect of these fantasized scenes could be as potent in influence as an episode actually experienced. He reached the conclusion, later verified in many directions by other investigators, that in the depths of the child mind there are lived through, during the developmental period, complex problems of love relationships which bear a sexual coloring. The process of growth in the sexual life begins in dependent infancy, where such emotional needs are directed towards the parents, particularly the mother who feeds and tends, and it ends with self-reliant youth whose sexual interests and affectionate capacities are in sufficient degree released from earlier attachments to be available for future normal and unhampered alliances outside the family. The conscious fantasies of the hysteric were but bizarre expressions of stages in the psychosexual love life of childhood which had not been successfully lived through, and in which for some reason the individual was held fast, unable to move forward in an orderly evolution towards a normal goal. Fresh from his researches, and with the theories which seemed to him justifiably established, Freud hastened with the enthusiasm his new message inspired to lay his discoveries before the scientific world, apparently forgetting the experience of former pioneers in medicine and other fields who had been denied by their own generation. He expected his work would be fairly measured and judged in accordance with its real worth. It did not take him long to become disillusioned. His offerings were rejected. No scientific body would listen to him. He was ridiculed, reviled, and condemned. Friends turned from him, and even his colleague, Breuer, reluctantly took his stand with the opposition. The revolutionary concept of an active, unconscious mental life over which the individual had little control was enough in itself to startle a world which had always believed that it knew its own mind and naturally caused it to throw up vigorous defenses. But it was the emphasis on the part played by the sexual life of man which set off the conflagration of war till the fields of psychiatry and psychology rocked with tumult. Confident that he had the evidence to prove his claims, Freud, although stunned by this reception, remained undaunted. To avoid being drawn into useless controversy and the exchange of personalities, he retired from the field of open battle and for a decade worked on alone, publishing his results from time to time for those to read who choose. On this period, Freud comments as follows, quote, "Since, however, my conviction of the general accuracy of my observations and conclusions grew and grew, and as my confidence in my own judgment was by no means slight, any more than my moral courage, there could be no doubt about the outcome of the situation. I made up my mind that it had been my fortune to discover particularly important connections, and was prepared to accept the fate that sometimes accompanies such discoveries. I could imagine the future somewhat as follows. I should probably succeed in sustaining myself by means of the therapeutic success of the new method, but science would ignore me entirely during my lifetime. Some decades later, someone would infallibly come upon the same things for which the time was not yet ripe, would achieve recognition for them and bring me to honor as a forerunner whose failures had been inevitable. Meanwhile, I settled down, like Robinson, as comfortably as possible on my lonely island. When I look back at those lonely years, away from the pressure and preoccupations of today, it seems to me like a glorious, heroic era. My splendid isolation was not lacking in advantages and in charms. I had not to read any publications nor listen to any ill-informed opponents. I was not subject to influence from any quarter. No one attempted to hurry me. I learned to restrain speculative tendencies and to follow the unforgotten advice of my master, Charcot, to look at the same things again and again until they themselves begin to speak. There was no need for my writings, for which with some difficulty I found as a publisher to keep pace with my knowledge. They could be postponed as long as I pleased. There was no doubtful, quote, priority to be secured. All this time my writings were not reviewed in the medical journals, or if by an exception this happened, they were scouted with contemptuous or pitying arrogance. Occasionally a colleague would make some reference to me in one of his publications, and it would be very short and not at all flattering, such as eccentric, extreme, or very peculiar ideas." Unquote. The last few decades have shown that Freud's predictions as to his own place in the field of medical psychology were too modest. Within that time, his influence has extended all over the world. While complete acceptance of the whole Freudian system is confined to a relatively small group, certain important features of it have increasingly influenced the scientific world and furnished the dominant note in much of psychiatry and psychology. The accepted terminology of these subjects contains many words originated by Freud to express new meanings. It has been well said that modern psychiatry without Freud would be quite unthinkable, and the rapid development of the subject of psychopathology has been in large measure made possible by psychoanalysis. Freud did not pass wholly unscarred through this long period of neglect and isolation. He states, quote, "Experience shows that only very few persons are capable of preserving courtesy in a scientific dispute, to say nothing of keeping to the point, and an altercation about a scientific matter has always been odious to me. Perhaps this attitude on my part has been misunderstood. Perhaps I have been thought so good-natured or so easily intimidated that no further notice need be taken of me. This was a mistake. I can rave and revile as well as anybody, but I do not find it's so easy to give expression in a manner suitable for publication to the emotions involved, and I therefore abstain entirely from the attempt." Unquote. On the special hostility shown by his German confreres, he comments further, quote, "Even today, 1925, it is, of course, impossible for me to foresee the final judgment of posterity upon the value of psychoanalysis for psychiatry, psychology, and the mental sciences in general. But I fancy that when the history of the phase we have lived through comes to be written, German science will not have cause to be proud of those who represented it. I am not thinking of the fact that they rejected psychoanalysis or the decisive way in which they did so. Both of these things were easily intelligible. They were only to be expected, and at any rate they threw no discredit upon the character of the opponents of analysis. But for the degree of arrogance which they displayed, for their conscienceless attempt of logic, and for the coarseness and bad taste of their attacks, there could be no excuse." By 1905, Freud's writings had gained attention from serious students, and from then onward an increasing number of followers, first in Vienna and later in Germany, England, and the United States, were enlisted in the work. In 1906, the public support of Zurich School of Psychiatry under Bleuler and Jung gave a vigorous impetus to the new psychology. Among those men and women who joined the psychoanalytic group during this period were some of the most gifted minds in medicine and other fields, and the contributions of these associates have been only second in value to those of Freud. In 1909, Freud, Jung, and others were invited by the late Dr. Stanley Hall, then president of Clark University at Worcester, Massachusetts, to give lectures at the celebration of the institution's 20th anniversary. Under the leadership of Dr. Hall, Clark University had developed a department of psychology, which was well known both in the United States and in Europe. The proceedings of the meeting were published in the American Journal of Psychology and given wide circulation. The meeting at Worcester marked the first official sanction of the psychoanalytic school, and from then on its influence spread still more rapidly. What this recognition meant to the man who had worked so long in relative obscurity can be best expressed in Freud's own words. "At that time I was only 53, I felt young and healthy, and my short visit to the New World encouraged my self-respect in every way. In Europe I felt as though I were despised, but over there I found myself received by the foremost men as an equal. As I stepped on to the platform of Worcester to deliver my 5 lectures upon psychoanalysis, it seemed like the realization of some incredible daydream. Psychoanalysis was no longer a product of delusion, it had become a valuable part of reality." Appreciation given to his doctrine in America did not blind him to certain limitations on the part of the new country for impartial scientific inquiry, resulting from the freedom of thought and easy enthusiasm permitted by less seasoned scientific standards than those of older civilizations. He continues, psychoanalysis, had not lost ground in America since our visit. It is extremely popular among the lay public, and it is recognized by a number of official psychiatrists as an important element in medical training. Unfortunately, however, it has suffered a great deal from being watered down. Moreover, many abuses which have no relation to it find a cover under its name, and there are few opportunities for any thorough training in technique or theory. In America, too, it has come in conflict with behaviorism, a theory which is naive enough to boast that it has put the whole problem of psychology completely out of court. On the same theme, 10 years earlier, he commented thus, "The absence of any deep-rooted scientific tradition in America and the much less stringent rule of official authority there have been decidedly advantageous to the movement which Stanley Hall started. It was characteristic of that country that from the beginning both professors and superintendents of mental hospitals, as well as independent practitioners, were all equally interested in analysis. But it is clear that precisely for this reason the centers of ancient culture, where the greater resistance has been displayed, must be the scene of the final decisive battle for psychoanalysis. It could not be expected that a movement so rapidly in development and wide in scope as psychoanalysis would be free from dissension within its own ranks as well as opposition from without. On the whole, there has been extraordinary unanimity on basic principles, with increasing division over lesser issues as observation, research, and speculation grow in breadth and depth. Three major defections from the purely Freudian psychoanalytic school have occurred since 1910, the first two of them being led by Jung and Adler, respectively, and more recently a third under the leadership of Rank. This is not the place to outline these special movements in detail. To the impartial student, it seems clear enough that all of these divergent schools have a common origin and are deeply rooted in the work of Freud. Moreover, it is not so evident that in their divergencies there has developed any fundamental inconsistency or mutual exclusiveness in relation to the more strictly Freudian concepts. Adler's system of individual psychology appears most difficult to reconcile with the psychoanalysis proper. Critics of Adler's work feel that he has been guilty of undesirable overgeneralization and oversimplification. While in minimizing the importance of unconscious mentality and of sexuality, he has cut off most connections with psychoanalysis, as indeed he maintains, leaving the complex manifestations of clinical psychology to be explained by a few elementary principles and motives. His system has the advantage, at least, of being easily grasped by the lay public and thereby being more readily available to them for practical self-help. Whatever else may be charged against the special contributions of Jung and Rank, oversimplification will not be one of them. The theoretical constructions of each of them are extraordinarily involved as contrasted with those of Freud and contain more of the philosophical approach. To feel that both have contributed substantially to psychoanalytic doctrine and given needed supplements in many points in no way detracts from a respect for Freud's own work. As Steckel himself, in some degrees a dissenter, happily puts the matter in metaphor, a pygmy on the shoulders of a giant may see farther than the giant himself. But whatever the attitude of the open-minded and the conciliatory student may be towards the common purpose and principles of schools, many of the adherents of the original Freudian system think differently. For them, apparently, there is no compromise. Either one is within the fold of true psychoanalysis, or one is completely outside. or one is completely outside, with no common interest or points of communication. In this respect, it has been well said that many of his disciples are more Freudian than is Freud himself. It is a fact that he has been in an unusual degree ready to consider views and findings which conflict with his own, and has frequently modified the latter under such influences. It is equally true that against certain major principles of these divergent groups, he has taken a vigorous and unyielding stance. To that system of psychoanalysis which is his original contribution and still under his leadership, in his eyes they do not belong. The controversy over these matters has been waged with some bitterness, but it is fair to say of Freud that he has never lowered his dignity or compromised with a scientific-minded viewpoint. It would seem regrettable that this attitude, together with a refusal to be involved in personalities, has not been a more potent example to some of his followers. With reference to the charge of intolerance and dictatorship on the part of some of his critics, Freud points to a wide group of associates who work with him harmoniously for many years and states, "I think I can say in my defense that an intolerant man, dominated by an arrogant belief in his own infallibility, would never have been able to maintain his hold upon so large a number of intelligent people, especially if he had at his command as few practical attractions as I had." While it is natural to regret the strong feeling between factions in the psychoanalysis as prejudicial to an unhampered search for truth, it is probable that the rigid adherence of the central group to certain fundamental principles based on biological approach to the subject has been of distinct advantage to the new science. Any psychology other than behaviorism that ventures out of the protection of the laboratory must necessarily be subjective and vague in comparison with the more objective natural sciences. If each student of psychoanalysis had given free rein to the hypotheses for which the observed facts in research offer tempting possibilities, the whole system might well have been dissipated into nebulous obscurity before it had been fairly been born. By sticking fast to the sexual nature of instinct and refusing to be moved away from the biological and materialistic background of psychology, Freud and his immediate followers have been able to put before the whole world a body of data so definite and theories of such clarity as can be grasped by all in common understanding, and thus give a fixed platform from which to start off, whether for rejection or acceptance. Changes in doctrine have come about fast enough in the past so that it is easy to predict that many more will occur, but whatever developments are in store, the concept of the sexual libido theory, plus those of the unconscious mind and of mental conflict, to be discussed later, will stand as a firmly entrenched nucleus of psychoanalytic principles to which divergent movements may turn back to find a common ground. Freud's writings have been extensive. Since 1900, an uninterrupted stream of publications has been issued from his hand. In addition to the more strictly medical aspects of psychoanalysis, he has dealt with its application to a wide variety of allied subjects. In all his work has steadfastly endeavored to distinguish between observation and theory, and is ready at all times to admit himself baffled in the solution of a problem. His style is terse and to the point, and is not lacking in literary qualities of a high order. There has been no systematic presentation by him of psychoanalysis as a school of psychology. He has deliberately refrained from such a project, feeling that psychoanalytic knowledge is too fragmentary and scattered to permit, up to the present time, any complete systemization. Most of his published work before 1920 dealt with special topics to which his clinical observations and reflections served to lead him. There has been no attempt to follow out all these matters exhaustively. Going as far as he feels justified in one direction, he has no hesitation in dropping the subject for the time being, or perhaps forever, and starting on a new quest. Later in life, he was less bound to the scientific method of observation and deduction, and launched deliberately into a more speculative discussion of the extensions and implications of psychoanalytic principles. He says, quote, "In the works of my latter years, I have given free rein to the inclination for speculation which I kept down for so long," and again. And again, I should not like to create an impression that during this last period of my work I have turned my back upon patient observation and have abandoned myself entirely to speculation. I have, on the contrary, always remained in the closest touch with the analytical material, and have never ceased working at the detailed points of clinical or technical importance. Even when I have moved away from observation, I have carefully avoided any contact with philosophy proper. This avoidance has been greatly facilitated by constitutional incapacity. One of Freud's latter books, The Future of an Illusion, 1928, deals with the subject of religion, and is at least a logical development of his original biological concept of the psychic life of man. His conclusions concerning the religious strivings of mankind, like some others to which he has arrived, do not go unchallenged by many who at the same time are quite willing to accept him as a leader in the fields of psychology and psychopathology. Impaired health finally led Freud into a semi-retirement, but it did not cut him off by any means from continued clinical work, nor ended his active leadership. From his seclusion, he was in close touch with the developments in psychoanalytic doctrine which were taking place in all the leading centers of learning. In his critical estimate, he maintained a rare open-mindedness, and before his death even revised materially some of his own ideas under the influence of the work of others. The final paragraph of the autobiographical study gives Freud's contemporary estimate of his own work. By a process of development against which it would have been useless to struggle, the word psychoanalysis has itself become ambiguous. While it was originally the name of a particular therapeutic method, it has now also become the name of a science, the science of unconscious mental processes. By itself, this science is seldom able to deal with a problem completely, but it seems destined to give important contributory help in a large number of regions of knowledge. The sphere of application of psychoanalysis extends as far as that of psychology, to which it forms a complement of the greatest moment. Looking back, then, over the patchwork of my life's labors, I can say that I have made many beginnings and thrown out many suggestions. Something will come of them in the future, but I cannot tell myself whether it will be much or little. Chapter 4. Nervous Illness, the Neuroses. It has been shown in the previous chapter that the principles of psychoanalytic psychology were developed from a study of nervous illness, and the history of psychoanalysis is closely connected with the problem of nervous disorders. Movements of enormous significance often enough have comparatively insignificant beginnings. Pasteur, the French chemist, was sought out by the discouraged brewers of his city to aid them in preventing the souring of beer. By accurate and ingenious methods of observation and experiment, he was led to the conclusion that the spoiling of beer was not due, as has been supposed, to spontaneous inner changes, but to the effect of something which came from the outside atmosphere. The investigation led ultimately to the discovery of the whole new world of microorganisms, which activities intimately concern the welfare of human beings, and the control which exact knowledge made possible brought revolutionary changes to medicine and other fields. In a setting as undramatic as was Pasteur's, Freud undertook to learn something more about certain of his nervous patients whose symptoms had defied previous understanding and were refractory to ordinary methods of treatment. The studies thus humbly originated have produced another epoch-making revolution, this time not primarily concerned with the physical universe by which man is surrounded, but by the workings of his own mind. Upon the basis of a new grasp of the subject of nervous illness has arisen the whole structure of psychoanalytic psychology, which in its scope touches practically all aspects of human interest and activity. At the time of Freud's original work, little was known about the cause and nature of nervous symptoms other than that they often had no important physical basis, and that they could be explained on no rational grounds. There was no established method of treatment which could be taught or learned. Each physician who chose to bother with such troublesome problems followed his own bent and called upon the resources of his experience and intuition to guide him. Hypnotic suggestion was a more exact method and therefore an exception to the general rule of every physician for himself, but its limitations were soon reached and it could never serve as a comprehensive system. Breuer's discovery that traumatic psychic experiences of the past could continue to cause effects long after they were forgotten broke the deadlock between the medical profession and the nervous patient who had challenged therapy and defied understanding. In spite of the fact that this first doctrine proved to have been a limited truth, it did open the door and point the way to the hitherto hidden field of psychopathology. From the standpoint of simplicity and the universal love of the dramatic, it is to be regretted that Breuer's theory of the speculation of the spectacular connection of nervous symptoms with the past traumatic experience does not more often hold good. That portion of an interested public who have a speaking acquaintance with psychoanalytic principles, as well as neurotic patients themselves, often expect such a clear-cut relation between symptom and cause, and are disappointed when it is not revealed. They may even be critical, as if a system to which they gave credence had failed to live up to its claims. However, such simple connections were first studied by Freud and Breuer, and independently by Janet, do occur just often enough to illustrate discussion and offer always an effective demonstration of how psychological situations of the past can be carried over to the present quite unchanged, preserved, so to speak, in the storage vaults of the unconscious. Unhappily for the patient, the aftermath of a disturbing experience is something more than a mere record which can be safely stowed away in the hidden recesses of the mind. No matter how tight the door may be closed, it still operates as a powerful force affecting the mental life and may influence the intermediate reactions of the present as strikingly as though the actual occurrence was taking place at the moment. The only way to an undesirable psychic state can be prevented from influencing an individual for harm is in some way to bring it into harmonious relationship with the rest of the mental life. Fortunately, this seems to go on for the most part spontaneously, and nothing has to be done about it by conscious effort. Exceptions to this rule occur and are familiar to everyone. The difference in effect between an experience which is mentally assimilated and one which is not may be illustrated by an everyday example. If an average man is publicly insulted and humiliated by another and for some reason is not able to retaliate, he has in the memory of the experience a disturbing influence in his mental life, and this case quite consciously. The memory of the incident rankles and annoys. In the still hours of the night it becomes relentless back to harass him. He goes over and over the scene and thinks too late of the things he might have said and done, while anger and shame flood him. Now let him meet his insulter face to face, and by some physical encounter or a few well-chosen words put him thoroughly in his place. Immediately the stress of the previous memory will be eliminated forever. The painful emotion has found an outlet for discharge, and the score is settled. A more highly developed and civilized character should be able to accomplish the same result in a less primitive and robust manner through purely subjective means. He may reason that the other man really damaged only himself by insult, that as a superior he will not stoop to the battle with fists or words, that what someone of little worth may say in the heat of passion affects the true truth of things not a bit, and so on. Conscious of his own courage and rectitude, this type of man may be as little touched by insult as he would be carried away by flattery. With such resources, and in such manner, he can in his own way completely dissipate the painful emotion. Either method, from the standpoint of mental health, is entirely effective, one, in banishing harmful emotions. Either method, from the standpoint of mental health, is an entirely effective one in banishing harmful emotion. An equally successful procedure, so far as relief from conscious pain is concerned, is that of a repression, that is, purposeful forgetting, accomplished automatically without awareness or conscious effort. But in the latter case, in contrast to the former, comfort is gained at a serious and exorbitant cost, because the memory thus banished is not destroyed, but remains with undiminished emotional energy turned loose in the unconscious mind, where it is out of control of reason and will, with all the resulting possibility of undesirable effects. Repression and of painful memories is sometimes dramatic in the extreme. A nurse during the First World War, after a period of exhausting vigil, gave a soldier the wrong medicine, which contributed to his death. In her despair, she went into a state of delirium, and on recovery had no memory of the distressing and tragic episode. If this forgetting had been the only result, it might have been the best thing for all concerned. But the girl, following this abnormal repression, developed other symptoms, including mental depression and general inefficiency. It therefore seemed necessary that she be helped to bring back to consciousness the sad story and aided to face it in a more robust and constructive way than by, quote, forgetting. Footnote: repression, used in the sense of the unconscious mental mechanism, should be differentiated from the conscious avoidance of painful thoughts, called suppression. There is no sharp line of distinction between these processes which merge into each other, those of repression and those of suppression. A woman of 38 was sent to a psychiatrist on account of the effect of an automobile accident which could not be explained by any physical injury which had been received. She was weak, listless, and apprehensive. She spent much time in bed and was forced to give up housekeeping and send her children to relatives. She dreaded going to sleep on account of vivid dreams in which she lived over the experience. Inquiry elicited that she had tried to overcome the shock of the accident by banishing thoughts of it from her mind. Suppression, that is to say. To aid in this purpose, no one in home was allowed to refer to it. She refused to give attention to insurance matters and shunned newspapers to avoid notice of other accidents. According to the theory of inadequacy and dangers of such procedure, some features of her difficulty seemed evident. While partially successful in driving the painful memory from consciousness, it was retained in full vigor somewhere just outside. To prevent its return, she was under continuous strain, with the consequent penalty of fatigue. When she was off guard, as in sleep, the distressing memory came back to her in dreams. It was clear that her method for the disposal of the effect of a disturbing incident was not a good one. Based on the theories above outlined, the way to aid her to a better solution was plain. She was told that the memory of the accident should not be banished by main force, and that, as an alternative, she must digest and assimilate it. She was persuaded to talk over the occurrence in detail, the crash and the shock, and to be sure, but also the escape of all the party from serious injury, and the occasion for gratitude, therefore. She was urged to consider the fact that some hazard is an inevitable part of life, that one accident encourages caution, which reduces the likelihood of another. She was instructed not to avoid the subject at home, but to go over it in conversation, with special emphasis on the happy outcome and the optimistic side of things in general. This program worked like a charm. In a few days, distressing dreams had disappeared. The patient was more active and energetic, and in a short time, the experience of the accident took its normal place with other experiences in the ups and downs of life. This same woman, when asked about her family, showed deep emotion as she told of the death of her father 12 years before. Her manifestations of grief were much as though the bereavement had recently occurred. It was found that once again she had endeavored to use the method of repression in meeting the loss of her father, to whom she was more than more than usually attached. She had tried to put his memory from her mind and never talked of him with others of the family. As before, it seemed wise to advise her to reverse her policy. She and her mother were urged to talk freely of the father and of their happy life together. In earlier times, as might be expected, this brought more relief than pain and contributed towards aiding her to be reconciled to her father's death. It is, of course, highly probable that these two examples represented a general type of reaction in this woman to all sorts of outer and inner difficulties, and she might well profit by more fundamental aid for her pattern of mental adjustments than could be brought about simply by helping her to face a few special problems. The story of a foreign missionary shows a more deeply hidden mechanism responsible for nervous symptoms. In his late 30s, this man had increasingly difficulty with nervousness. One of the most striking symptoms was an obsessive and unendurable fear of drunken men. Such a symptom affected a serious curtailment of his activities. If a person with any evidence of intoxication got on one end of a streetcar, the minister precipitately got out the other, impelled by an irresistible impulse. This fear was in contrast to the man's general character. He was no coward, and in his missionary work he had faced real dangers without flinching. He consulted a physician who put him under hypnotic influence. While in this condition, he related a childhood scene of a drunken father coming into home in a state of rage and violence. On awakening from hypnosis, he scoffed at the idea of there being any truth in this story as applied to himself. Persuaded to confer with his mother, he found to his utter astonishment that the events were corroborated by her as experiences in which he himself had participated. The family had come from the British Isles. The father in early days was a drunkard. For a period in the patient's young childhood, it was not an infrequent occurrence for the mother to seize the small boy by the hand, snatch his baby sister from the cradle, and to run to the neighbors for protection. When the patient was 4 years old, the father reformed and came to the United States, where he studied for the ministry and became a successful evangelist. With the religious conversion and the father and this new start in life, it was the special purpose of all concerned to bury the past, and it was never referred to. The patient could never fully recall these violent scenes of his childhood, but certain features of them came dimly into his mind. The process of discussion, however, and the explanation given by the physician resulted in the prompt disappearance of his fear of drunken men. He still had plenty of other nervous symptoms, but the particular disturbing phobia was banished as by magic, when the experience which determined it was brought up from the depths of his mind towards the light of day, ventilated in conversation with the physician, and by the application of more mature values became detached from the terrifying associations of childhood. To repeat, with the religious conversion of the father and this new start in life, it was the special purpose of all concerned to bury the past, and it was never referred to. The patient could never fully recall these violent scenes of his childhood, but certain features of them came dimly into his mind. The process of discussion, however, and the explanation given by the physician resulted in the prompt disappearance of his fear of drunken men. He still had plenty of other nervous symptoms, but the peculiar disturbing phobia was banished as by magic, when the experience which determined it was brought up from the depths of his mind towards the light of day, ventilated in conversation with the physician, and by the application of more mature values became detached from the terrifying associations of childhood. The significance of this first discovery in psychoanalysis, then, may be summed up as follows. The idea of a foreign body in the unconscious mind as the legacy of a traumatic experience is a useful figure of speech with a measure of validity as the basis for special symptoms, and in exceptional cases shows what actually does occur. The symptom in these special instances is connected with a specific experience of the past, the memory of which has been disposed of through repression. Continuing the metaphor of the foreign body, the resulting symptom, as in the case of the missionary, may be banished by successful exploration, discovery, and removal by the method of mental surgery. To quote, mental surgery. However, this theory, in spite of occasional spectacular illustrations to confirm it, proved to have sharp limitations, and the majority of nervous symptoms show a far more intricate causation. The foreign body theory, therefore, was but a first step, which alone would make small impressions on the problem of nervous disorders either in theory or in therapy. A later and more comprehensive explanation of what lies behind nervous symptoms was furnished by the concept of mental conflict. Conscious mental conflict, such as the time-honored one, quote, twixt love and duty, and many others are familiar to all. In this sense, nobody is ever free from the necessity for choice, decision, and self-control. Appreciation of the place and importance of unconscious mental conflict has been a contribution of psychoanalysis. Conflict in this region is far more general and diffuse in the personality than that between the self as a whole against the shock of an experience remaining undigested in the mind. Unconscious mental conflict is conceived by psychoanalysis as taking place between the instincts seeking direct expression in opposition to social ideals, or better, to the part of the individual ego which represents the social ideals. The instincts comprise the more elementary and primitive tendencies of the human animal. The social ideals represent the more mature strivings and are in accord with the general welfare of the group as a whole. To repeat this important point, going back, unconscious mental conflict is conceived by psychoanalysis as taking place between the instincts seeking direct expression in opposition to social ideals, or better, to that part of the individual ego which represents the social ideals. The instincts comprise the more elementary and primitive tendencies of the human animal. The social ideals represent the more mature strivings and are in accord with the general welfare of the group as a whole. Viewed in the large, civilization and culture means a progressive socialization of the human instincts. Each person must repeat much of this process in his own life. The primitive and individualistic child grows up by an orderly psychological development to the socialized adult, who is supposed to be adjusted and subordinate to the group. Still to repeat again, viewed in the large, civilization and culture mean a progressive socialization of the human instincts. Each person must repeat much of this process in his own life. The primitive and individualistic child grows up by an orderly psychological development to the socialized adult, who is supposed to be adjusted and subordinate to the group. In the neurotic, there has been a failure somewhere in this orderly psychological development, and the basis is thereby laid down for mental conflict and nervous symptoms. Man has been referred to as a being at birth, psychologically speaking, a mob. His task in development to maturity is to mold the mob into an orderly self-governing state. By the same token, we may look upon the neurotic as one unable to accomplish this task completely. Certain members of the mob within him have refused to give allegiance to the government. They exist as an outlaw group, always in opposition and often at war with the more settled population. The conflict between instinct and ideal is by no means confined to the unconscious. In many fields of life, most strikingly perhaps in that of sex, such conflict is obvious and universal for all men. What psychoanalysis has shown is that these conscious conflicts represent but the simplest and, in a sense, least important of mental problems. In dealing with them, one has, so to speak, the enemy in the open. The problems are above board and understandable, and the resources of intelligence and character are thereby available for their solution. In the obscurity of the unconscious are a myriad other mental forces, complex, subtle, elusive, and often enough incompatible, which must inevitably war vigorously with each other. Some sort of established unity or successful compromise created from out of all these forces means mental health. The opposite spells neurosis. Conscious conflict has the immense advantage Conscious conflict has the immense advantage of being under the influence of reason and will. Unconscious conflict lies as far outside the reach of these agencies as do the bodily functions of digestion and circulation. It would be a misapprehension to look on the matter of deep-lying psychic conflict as one between the forces of evil and darkness arrayed against virtue and light. It is not a question of morality, but rather one of maturity. It would be nearer the truth to sense in an unconscious conflict a struggle between childishness on the one hand and grown-upness on the other, between the forces that would hold one to the self-indulgent, irresponsible past and those that urge towards independent and independent future gained only by the acceptance of some sort of inner self-obligation and self-denial. It is common and quite correct to describe certain poor traits of behavior of adults as childish. It is just as true, though less obvious, that hidden deep below the level of observable behavior may be present other features of childishness which profoundly handicap the individual for the grown-up world in which he must live, and which form the material of neurotic conflict. It would be far from the truth, once more, to picture unconscious mental conflict as a sharply circumscribed contest between two opposing tendencies, which, as it were, fight each other in some psychic arena, while the rest of the mind takes on the role of spectator, comfortably seated in the grandstand. The most simple conflict issue must in some measure involve the whole psyche and comprise many factors related and interrelated. From all these, though some failure of spontaneous solution, there occurs between the balance of forces an impasse which cannot be overcome in a constructive manner, and a compromise in the form of a neurosis is the alternative. The battle between opposing tendencies in the mind may be made more clear by homely illustration. In the plot include a young man, a cold morning, a warm bed, and an alarm clock. All the more simple, instinctive impulses cry out to the youth to draw blankets tighter and take another nap. Ambition, duty, self-respect, and so on urge him upward and outward. Here is indeed conflict. The highly disciplined man may hardly be aware of a struggle as he rises on schedule. His over-weak brother may stay in bed at all cost, with resulting loss of his job or other penalty. The average person groans and postpones decisions, but rise he will in time to avoid disaster. Now, if one can in imagination magnify this cold morning conflict many times and sink it below the level of consciousness, he may then get a picture of that opposition of forces which make life always a struggle between those influences which hold the individual back and those which drive him on. Mental conflict, then, is the central essence of nervous illness, and according to psychoanalytic theory, is the first of three major processes which are involved. The second one is repression, already referred to. Or to repeat again, mental conflict, then, is the central essence of nervous illness, and according to psychoanalytic theories, is the first of three major processes which are involved. The second is repression, already referred to. Repression is the term applied to the mental process in the neurosis by which painful or unpleasant content is either kept out of consciousness altogether or eliminated from it. The purpose of repression is defense. The individual needs to be protected from forces within himself. Repression spares him the distressing mental awareness of problems with which he is unable to cope in any progressive manner. The third process in the structure of neurosis concerns symptom formation. Unconscious conflict is highly charged with energy, which surges toward expression in thought and action. Repression blocks the direct route to consciousness. Neither side of the conflict can be given direct outlet without, in a way, violating or denying the other. The factors involved are mutually exclusive. Symptom formation makes possible an indirect and compromised expression and outlet. Symptom formation makes possible an indirect and compromised expression and outlet. A symptom is composed of the factors of conflict in disguise, and the forces of repression let it pass by. Both sides find some degree of release and satisfaction. A simple example will clarify. A person has instinctive inclination to do injury to others. His moral self stands across the path. A simple example will clarify. A person has instinctive inclination to do injury to others. His moral self stands across the path. He develops violent spasmodic movements in his body, and such as his arms. By this symptom is given symbolic outlet to his evil desire, in a manner akin to the superstitious magic of primitive peoples. Meantime, his moral nature is unviolated on account of the futility of the procedure, or is appeased by the discomfort the symptom produces. It permits, so to speak, a certain indulgence of outlaw instinct by the payment of tribute in suffering. adjustment of a sort is accomplished by a symptom formation. One is inadequate, often serious handicap to ordinary living, and a cause of new suffering. But to the patient, in his extremity, it seems after all the lesser of two evils. For the purpose of illustration, the symptom formation let us build up a fanciful allegory in which the neurotic individual is pictured by a family scene. A small boy represents the instinct side of conflict, and his mother the social strivings of the ego. The boy desires to cut off the cat's tail. The mother forbids. An impasse results. The child must cut off the tail. The mother will not permit. After stormy negotiations, a compromise is effected. The scissors are restored to the child, and he is allowed to cut up pictures of cats in any way he chooses. The child finds indirect outlet for his desire, and the mother's code is not violated. Both child and mother are satisfied. This illustration is inadequate, for in order to parallel the development of a neurosis, the figurative symptom of cutting up the pictures should be a disagreeable process to the child and unpleasant to the mother. The illustration is inadequate, for in order to parallel the development of a neurosis, the figurative symptom of cutting up the picture should be a disagreeable process to the child and an unpleasant to the mother. If a similar happy solution should occur in individual mental conflict, there would be no neurosis. Rather than representing a nervous symptom, the example better exemplifies sublimation, that is, an appropriate and useful compromise adjustment springing from conflict. The whole illustration is a poor one from another standpoint. Again, it should be emphasized that the instinctive side of life is not all violence and passion. Often enough, it appears more in the nature of simple inertia, a protest against the hardship of growth and development. For this phase, the reluctance of the small boy to get out of bed on a cold morning might be used as a better figure than a desire to amputate the cat's tail. An actual case will be more satisfactory as an example of symptom formation. A young woman, after the death of her father, developed an obsessive fear that she would do harm to somebody unknown and undergo relentless punishment for her crime. She realized the absurdity of her fear, but suffered nonetheless for it. She grew worse, and life became centered in this obsessive symptom. What did it all mean? A little study made it clear. The father had been domineering and tyrannical, but at the same time he had managed to inspire the admiration and deep devotion of his daughter. On the surface she had lived peacefully enough. Unconsciously, however, there had been more profound hostility and more intense love than she could possibly realize. These attitudes were in opposition, but were held quiescent. These attitudes were in opposition, but were held quiescent until the father's illness. The mixed relief and sorrow at his death aroused this deep-lying conflict and disturbed its equilibrium, unstable at best. Deep within this girl's soul, a bitter hate towards her father for his restrictions waged battle against the love, duty, and dependency which she felt toward him. Her concern lest she do harm to persons unknown, with the accompanying fear and guilt, was a projection to the surface of hostility to the father, disguised so as not to outrage her conscious self, and punished by the rigors of an exaggerated conscience. By the symptom, then, expression was given in substitute and disguised form both to the feeling of hatred against the father and to the moral ideal which abhorred such an unfilial attitude. Behind the thought of doing harm was a hostile wish, while motivating the fear which accompanied it was a protest of love and morality. The neurosis occurring among soldiers during war and miscalled shell shock once more illustrate the mechanism of symptom formation. There is a fairly general agreement among the medical profession of all nations concerning certain of the more simple features of the nature and origin of these disorders. In the soldier, fear and distaste were arrayed against principle and loyalty. Straightforward solution to this conflict required suppression of one side and the dictation of attitude and action by the other. With certain men, a deadlock occurred between the two imposing influences. They would not shirk their duty, they could not subdue their fear. It was possible neither to carry on nor to give up. Something had to happen, and quickly. It was possible neither to carry on nor to give up. Something had to happen quickly. By a series of unconscious mechanisms operating under the influence of repression, this mental conflict was converted into physical symptoms, paralysis, tremor, or many others. Disabled by these symptoms, the man was relieved from duty and sent to a hospital. At the cost of suffering from symptoms, he evaded the conflict of fear versus duty by being transferred to a place of safety, while at the same time he avoided the sacrifice of principle and honor. Of the relation between symptom and conflict, he was wholly unaware. Otherwise, he was a malingerer and not a person ill with a neurosis. In the neurosis of peacetime, the mental conflicts responsible for symptoms are usually far more deep-seated and difficult to grasp in the neuroses of war, while the gain from illness is much less obvious. In the one case, conflict concerns an immediate situation of danger determined by external events. In the other, conflict deals with unsolved inner situations and dangers, heritage of the past and long divorced from external reality if ever connected with it, but brought over to the present as still active psychological problems. In the neurosis of peacetime, the mental conflicts responsible for symptoms are usually far more deep-seated and difficult to grasp than in the neuroses of war, while the gain from illness is much less obvious. In the one case, conflict concerns an immediate situation of danger determined by external events. In the other, conflict deals with unsolved inner situations and dangers, heritage of the past and long divorced from external reality if ever connected with it, but brought over to the present as still active psychological problems. Diagrammatically presented, the war neurosis can be seen in cross-section and near the surface, while those of peacetime require, for clear revealing, longitudinal section deep into the life structure of the individual. The fear and conflict which the soldier endures over his safety are understandable to all. The tumult and panic of the everyday neurotic are confined largely within his own mind and mean little to anybody but himself. Nervous symptoms violate all canons of rational thought. They are illogical in nature, and still more strikingly, they maintain themselves stubbornly against logical demonstration and influence. New psychoanalytic knowledge has enabled us to see that the irrationality of nervous symptoms is only seeming. In truth, they are the definite result of long chains of psychological happenings, often reaching back to childhood, and with many of the links hidden deep in the unconscious. The psychoanalytic method of treatment of neurosis is based upon the theory of their nature thus briefly outlined. The principle of treatment is to search out and reactivate the factors of unconscious conflicts and bring them so far as possible from the depths to the surface of the mind. This procedure is abetted by a certain compulsion to repetition, which applies to unsolved psychic problems. The patient is then in a more advantageous position than before to be helped to a new and better solution. The details of the method for accomplishing this purpose will be outlined in subsequent chapters. Chapter 5. The Psychoanalytic System of Psychology. It is not literally correct to speak of psychoanalysis as a system of psychology. Rather, does it consist in a body of material empirically established from observed clinical phenomena arising from the therapeutic study of patients. The slow and orderly steps which led to the accumulation of this data have already been described. Interpretation of the facts thus established has led to the psychoanalytic hypotheses, which are still fragmentary and somewhat unrelated. It cannot be too often emphasized that psychoanalysis did not start with a theory to which observed phenomena were later brought for its support. The facts were first gathered and the theories followed in an attempt to interpret them intelligently. Freud himself has deliberately refrained from the temptation to form a school of psychology and has directed his attention to the development of special topics or a long path of speculative thinking to which he has been led by his work with nervous patients or his reflections on more general problems. Up to the present time, there is to be found nowhere in the literature a systematic presentation of psychoanalytic psychology. In comparison with older schools of psychology, psychoanalysis contains new material and makes radical departures from other viewpoints. This matter may be summarized as follows. A. Psychoanalysis deals chiefly with the unconscious mental life, maintaining that the major portion of mental activity goes on outside the subject's awareness. To repeat, A. Psychoanalysis deals chiefly with the unconscious mental life, maintaining that the major portion, the quote, unconscious mental life, maintaining that the major portion of mental activity goes on outside the subject's awareness. Supported by what seems sufficient evidence, it is assumed that this unconscious mind consists in two parts. The first includes that which is present in a potential way at birth, brought over in some manner with the germ plasm along with other inherited qualities. This compromises what is called by Jung the collective or radical or racial unconscious. What is called by Jung the collective or racial unconscious and is emphasized by him perhaps unduly. The second part is built up from the life experiences of the individual. And is in that sense acquired. Jung called this the personal unconscious. It is composed of material, much of which at some time has been present in consciousness and later eliminated. From one cause or another, it is the personal unconscious which has been given the most consideration by Freud. To repeat, it is the personal unconscious, not the collective unconscious, which has been given most consideration by Freud. Consciousness contains at any given time only a fraction of what is available to us. The term preconscious is applied to mental content not at the moment conscious, but which can be brought back to consciousness on demand. That can be conscious on demand. The term preconscious is applied to mental content not at the moment conscious, but can be brought back on demand. Attention sharply limits the field of consciousness to one or a few matters at a time with obvious advantages. To repeat, consciousness contains at any given time only a fraction of what is available to it. The term preconscious is applied to a mental content not at the moment conscious, but which can be brought back on demand. Attention sharply limits the field of consciousness to only one or a few matters at a time, with obvious advantages. Attention is like a searchlight which focuses on one spot with some shading off on all sides to complete darkness. If the place lighted up is called the conscious mind, then all the dark area round about, which can be reached by the searchlight, is preconscious. To bring the unconscious into the simile, there would have to be an added subterranean vaults and cellars where no ray of light could readily penetrate. Unconscious mentality, then, in the psychoanalytic meaning, concerns only that matter which the unaided individual is powerless to grasp by any effort. B. Repression. Repression is established as a central psychological mechanism, meaning by repression a purposeful omission or elimination of material from the conscious mind by an unconscious mechanism. In normal states, this mechanism disposes of what is unnecessary and inconvenient for consciousness. In abnormal states, it takes care of what is intolerable and unsolvable by the consciousness. The difference between healthy and pathologic repression is chiefly one of degree. Healthy repression is a mechanism for efficient management of childish and social qualities which are common to all. Pathologic repression comes into play under special need and is used to evade tendencies which are so potent and in such crude contrast to anything acceptable by consciousness that they cannot be disposed of by more constructive means. In both cases, the material repressed remains in the unconscious. In the former, it is integrated into the structure of the mental organization and is compatible with health. In the latter, it remains unassimilated, is a source of inner mental disharmony, and is often the basis of neurosis and other maladjustments. In the special emphasis on the pathological features of this mechanism, incident to study of nervous disorders, the advantages of normal repression have been neglected. The conscious mind may be looked upon as a special agency to deal with an uncertain and often dangerous environment. As soon as adjustment of organism to environment becomes perfected in any field, there is no more need of special supervision, and the conscious mind is set free for other business. Thus, in the process of walking, a child at first takes each step with painstaking care, but later the function goes on automatically without need of conscious attention. Just as the board of managers of a business turn over special tasks to subordinates and leave themselves free for larger and unsolved issues, so the conscious mind of man transfers management to subordinate operatives. A good part of body functioning and the major proportion of the business of life in general is, so to speak, mentally delegated to the unconscious. This is not done by a destruction of psychic factors previously in operation, but by the process of repression. They are transferred to other regions of the mind. C. Psychoanalysis recognizes unconscious mental conflict as at once a factor in character development and beyond certain limits a source of psychic difficulties. As previously pointed out, the conception that such conflict may go on completely outside the conscious grasp of the individual is distinctive to psychoanalysis and fundamental to the modern consideration both of normal psychological development and of the nature and causation of nervous disorders. D. There is a new emphasis on infantile and child psychology, again stressing the unconscious features. Appropriate psychologic development at this early period is believed to lay down patterns of reaction which ensure satisfactory adult adjustments. On the other hand, failure in the solution of some basic developmental problems may result in the carrying over of these problems to adulthood as a sort of unfinished business on the part which complicates all latter mental reactions. Insofar as psychoanalytic psychology is a system, it is a psychology of the instincts, or rather the instinctive basis of mental processes, and thereby, as stated, it accepts a biological foundation. For a definition, let it be said that human instincts are urgent tendencies or dispositions appearing from somewhere in the shadow land between the physical and the mental, and vigorously striving towards expression. Freud postulates two groups of instincts, the sexual or procreative and the ego or the self-preservative. As has been pointed out, this implies a generalization and extension of meaning far beyond previous concepts. The sexual instincts in the narrow sense, as seen fully developed in the adult, are imperative in demand. Their satisfaction brings the highest degree of sensory pleasure, and in contrast, deprivation is acutely unpleasant. Even in the extended meaning of Freud, sexual instincts, conscious and unconscious, and at all stages of development, strive directly towards their individual goal, regardless of complication or consequence. Their one aim is to satisfy the particular need which they represent. The ego instincts are less individualistic in nature. The ego instincts are less individualistic in nature and less mutually exclusive. In general, to repeat, they compromise those instinctive dispositions which have to do with the maintenance of the individual and his adaptation to society. In a sense, these two groups are set in opposition. The sexual instincts strive for independent outlet, the ego instincts molding them to appropriate and useful social expression. From a fundamental biological consideration, the former serve to ensure the perpetuation of the race, the latter to preserve the individual from destruction in the process. Freud's earlier work dealt mainly with the first or sexual ones. This group is made up of a wide variety of factors, but all are reducible, according to him, to a common denominator, which in the wider sense is sexual in nature. Psychoanalysis has an energy concept of psychology analogous in a way to the energy concept of physics, and continuing the parallel, most of the energy manifestations of the psyche are derivatives from one common source, the procreative or sexual energy, the mental aspects of which are designated the libido. The mental aspects of the energy of which are designated libido. So libido are the mental aspects of sexual energy. In accordance with this concept, the so-called libido theory of Freud was developed as a central theme around which the elaborate structure of psychoanalysis has been built up. If there is criticism of this assumption on the ground that there are included too many unknowns, let it be answered that for a psychologic scheme one must begin somewhere. And such are the limitations of human knowledge that whatever point be chosen, it is still surrounded by unknowns. The behaviorists, in an attempt at definiteness, accept nothing in the psychologic realm except what is constructed from the action of environmental stimulus on a plastic organism. But again, the inevitable has not been avoided by this objective approach. They, like other schools, must postulate beyond knowledge. To deny an inherent impetus toward psychological growth and purposeful development implies a no less dogmatic assumption than the opposite. only it is a negative instead of a positive. There is gain, to be sure, a theory which does no violation to the logical thought processes of a mechanistic conception, but the result is a sterile thing which offends the well-nigh universal sense of the significance of the mental life of man. However, whether the fundamental conception of psychoanalytic psychology be true or false, wise or unwise, start it does on the basis of an inner vis a tergo, or vital force, in the nature of sexual instinct or libido. The influences of environment are important, to be sure, but still more so is the unfolding of some program of individual evolution which has its start from within. Freudian psychology, then, normal and abnormal, is most easily explained by tracing the libido development and its vicissitudes. Undifferential at birth, the libido goes through an orderly course of evolution from the simple organization of the child to the complex organization of the adult. This libido development manifests itself on two planes: development in relation to aim and development in relation to object. Aim development is concerned with the physical organism itself and with the libidinal investment of various bodily systems. At birth, the libido is diffusely and somewhat homogeneously attached to body orifices, special senses, skin and musculature, and indeed, in less evident manner probably, to all organ functions, which together are designated as infantile erogenous zones. From then until the age of 4 years or thereabouts, a reorganization takes place in the nature of differentiation and specialization, until the libido investment is drained away from other organs and more concentrated in the genitals. There follows a latency period extending to the time of puberty, during which the sexual organization from the biological side appears to remain stationary, and development goes on in other aspects of the personality. Freud points out that man, in contrast to other animals, has 2 periods of sexual development, one before and one after the latency period. At the end of this interlude, the reawakened sexual life establishes, so far as aim is concerned, a harmonious organic whole, manifested in the so-called primacy of the genital zone with subordinate coordination of the other erogenous zones. In the sex life of the adult, the aim organization of the libido is illustrated objectively by the act of coitus. In this consummation of the love relation to the genital goal is supported by other preliminary physical contacts, kissing, caressing, looking, and so on. For various reasons, orderly development of the libido in relation to aim does not always occur. Fixation may take place at various levels of development, and a too intense libido investment may remain permanently at some of the preliminary stages. More specifically, an undue amount of libido may be anchored to some of the infantile erogenous zones, such as the mouth and others, thus robbing the more normal functions of their growth. There is then discord rather than order among the libido elements, and a unified aim organization is prevented, leaving the individual variously handicapped in the working out of his love life. In the sexual field proper of adulthood, these over-invested partial impulses may come to the surface in a full flower with imperative demand and be the basis of what is known as sexual perversions. In a less crude and simple way, can often be explained such sexual abnormalities as impotence in men and frigidity in women. On the purely psychic side, where difficulty from similar libido disturbances more commonly shows itself, there may develop neurotic symptoms and other maladjustments. In this connection, Freud has referred to the neurosis as the negative of perversions, meaning that nervous symptoms can often be interpreted as a reaction to or defense against an inadequate or distorted libido distribution. Again, it must be emphasized that if one wishes to grasp clearly Freud's thought that sex, as he uses the term, means something more and different from what is usually understood. It is not sexual behavior and conscious attitudes that he has in mind so much as the psychological preparedness for behavior and attitude. That is, the subject's inner state of libido development. Crude illustration of nervous symptoms as negatives of the perversions may occasionally be seen. as, for example, in the not uncommon hysterical vomiting, choking, or fear of injury through taking food. This group of symptoms, often very thinly, covers an over-sexualization of the mouth zone. The sufferer is quite unconscious of his perverse inclinations and is only aware of the negative, which is expressed in the symptoms of fear and disgust. Viewed on the libido scale of development, such a person is nearer the level of the nursing infant than the genitalized adult. In the usual case of nervous disorder, however, there exists no such naive relation between libido distribution and symptom formation. On the contrary, involved intermediary steps make the connection seem remote. The theory of libido development in relation to object is less schematically simple than that with reference to aim. The brief presentation which follows requires an oversimplification which can hardly be conducive to conviction. It is hoped, however, that it may at least be tentatively accepted and thereby make more clear the discussion of therapy in subsequent chapters. It is evident that some theoretical formulation is necessary in order to think clearly at all. Psychoanalytic investigation has revealed certain happenings during psychological development which can be given form and best explained by the concept of libido activity. The mother, as dispenser of food and protection, is the first object of emotional interest on the part of the child, which interest Freud conceives as a libido manifestation. The necessary thwarting and rebuffs in training, weaning, and so on throw the child back on himself, and for a period the libido is engaged in self-love called narcissism. The autoerotic habits of early childhood, thumb-sucking, genital handling, and others, are physical manifestations of this narcissistically directed libido. The purely egotistic needs of early life must in great part be frustrated and disappointed by the realities of the environment, and the child then turns back to himself for satisfaction. The libido, so to speak, ebbs and flows according to the demand and opportunity. The self-directed libido, called narcissism, makes up an important factor in the individual's development. Out of it comes the sense of his own importance and gives ground for the self-esteem on the whole series of ego values which are essential if he is to keep his place in life. But man lives in relation to other human beings, not to himself alone, and therefore a great deal of the libido must again be directed outward. The goal of object development is to find access to other people or adult rather than infantile libido levels. From loving himself, the child appears next to love those like himself. And then, in psychoanalytic parlance, at the homosexual stage. Actual manifestation of this is often enough seen in the pre-adolescent boy who scorns girls, hero worships his leaders, idealizes his mates, and even who scorns girls, hero worships his leaders, idealizes his mates, and even not so infrequently makes some sexual experiments with them. Finally, in the normal case, a heterosexual level is attained when the major current of the libido, more and more differentiated and freed from attachments to self, family, and one's own sex, is directed outward to members of the opposite sex in preliminary attitudes toward latter mating. The much-discussed Oedipus complex belongs in the field of object relations. The child enters this phase at about the third year and in normal cases works through to a satisfactory The child enters this phase at about the third year and in normal cases works through to a satisfactory solution by the age of 5. Meeting this new situation marks an epoch in the libido development. Previously, the libido needs of the child of either sex were concerned chiefly with himself and with the mother, whom he only slowly recognized as an object apart. Also before this time, the physical manifestations of the libido had been of a pregenital nature, perhaps most strikingly illustrated by the infant by the use of the mouth zone in the functioning of nursing, but including, as already stated, a wide variety of bodily functions. The child is now precipitated into its first social situation with other persons as definite objects to whom he must establish a relationship, on what Freud insists on calling a genital level. If by the genital level used in this sense one simply recognizes a stage attained in which subject and object, the I and the thou, are more definitely emphasized than in more infantile states, he may at once avoid any suspicion of juvenile depravity and grasp more nearly what was meant is what is being talked about. The Oedipus situation has been designated the nuclear complex of the neuroses, and by the same token, it may be considered the nuclear complex of health. Simply presented, these statements imply that the way the child solves his early libido relationships with the parents determines his fitness or unfitness for meeting, later in life, other human relationships and the world of reality in general. The Oedipus situation may be conceived as the original three-sided love relationship made up of child and parents, most of the drama, be it emphasized once again, going on in the unconscious of the young Oedipus, a subjective triangle rather than an objective one. In this experience, there occurs the earliest apprenticeship in actual emotional adjustment, and the degree of its success or failure marks a good start or a poor one towards all future human relations. Using the boy for illustration, the little egoist wishes to monopolize his mother for a love object. Immediately, he finds himself in a critical dilemma. He must renounce the need for exclusive monopolization of his mother or find himself in competition with the father. If he holds to the first purpose, he must renounce his need for exclusive monopolization of his mother or find himself in competition with the father. If he holds to the first purpose, he must both wrong the father by usurping his rights and hate him as a rival. From these attitudes spring guilt and fear. Within limits, these guilt feelings furnish motive forces toward growth and progress. If too greatly exaggerated, however, they may act to crush and distort rather than to build up. At the best, there is enough left behind to leave the most individuals a heritage consisting of a vague inner sense of unworthiness. Here, perhaps in modern guise, is seen a bit of actual foundation for the old religious doctrine of original sin. The normal child solves this intolerable problem of the actual situation by a constructive renunciation which emancipates him from the complete emotional attachment to the mother and permits him to go forward to new ends. He gives up the actual parents and constructs new ideals which in a sense take their place. The father ideal furnishes the goal of manliness and masculinity towards which he strives. The mother ideal supplies him with the vision of love object which he may freely seek. Both act as guiding principles which lead him towards maturity. Other less fortunate children, unable actually to renounce the Oedipus situation and form from it new ideals, are forced to some unsatisfactory and compromised solution. This results in an imperfect orientation of their libidinal makeup, adequate perhaps for the remainder of childhood, but insufficient to give them the necessary freedom for adolescent and adult adjustments. More technically speaking, libido fixation may occur at any stage of object relation in a manner akin to those in relation to libido aim, and form in a similar way the basis for later neuroses or other abnormality. Finally, let it once more be recalled that most of this subjective drama of the emotional life, well named by somebody the family romance, goes on quite outside awareness, and often enough gives little or no surface evidence of its existence. Freud divides the sexual development of human beings into three periods, thereby contrasting it with the lower animals, where everything goes on in one process. The first, or period of infantile sexuality, includes the early years up to the fourth or fifth, during which time the libido evolution, with reference to aim and object organization, is worked out as heretofore described. Most of the elaborate changes in development going on during this time, both physical and mental, take place, so to speak, inside the borders of the child's own personality. In other words, where this development goes on successfully, there is little to show what is occurring from anything which may be observed in behavior or relationship with other people. The second, or latency period, extends from the fifth year to the onset of puberty. During this time, the libido organization, adequate or inadequate, remains relatively quiescent, and development goes on in other fields. These years of growth and training result in the piling up of social inhibitions to control the direct the instinct life when it is once more set free at puberty. This does not mean that the child will fail to respond if the direction of his interest is turned by environmental influence toward sexual matters in the ordinary sense, but he is not so spontaneously concerned, and the whole subject, the mysteries of marriage, conception, birth, and so on, gains new objective values. the more it has been possible by wise guidance to prevent mental attitudes of perplexity, fascination, unsatisfied curiosity, sinfulness, etc., the more does the topic of sex assume for the child an undistorted and proportionate place in the scheme of his life. To repeat, the more it has been possible by wise guidance to prevent mental attitudes of perplexity, fascination, unsatisfied curiosity, sinfulness, the more does the topic of sex assume for the child an undistorted and proportionate place in the scheme of his life. The third period, that of adult sexuality, sets in at puberty and flowers during adolescence. At this time, the onset of physical maturity gives enormous impetus to the sexual instincts which, as it were, find direct outlet to the external world through strong genital cravings. On the mental side, sexual problems take on a new import because they are from this time directly and specially involved with other persons. Quote, at puberty, the impulses and object relations of a child's early years become reanimated, and amongst them, the emotional ties of the Oedipus complex. The sexual life of puberty is a struggle between the impulses of early years and the inhibitions of the latency period. To those unfamiliar with the data of psychoanalytic findings, the theory of libido development, with its implications of infantile sexuality, often sound like the flimsiest vagaries of fantasy, or the pseudoscience of an ancient alchemy. It still further strains credulity to find that all these extraordinary proceedings of the libido go on outside the consciousness, and that until recently little has been directly observed in the behavior of children to substantiate these hypotheses, which are formulated instead as a reconstruction of the past from the study of the mental life of neurotic adults. However, theorizing is no new procedure in the progress of knowledge and demands no justification in itself. Psychoanalytic study of the human mind brings forth seemingly unequivocal data, completely overlooked by former methods of investigation. Psychoanalytic theories have been established in order to give working concepts for the interpretation and understanding of these findings. There is no reason to believe that these theories are complete or final. In fact, except in a few fundamentals, there have been continuous changes and developments since the beginning. Substitute theories that will explain facts as well and be as useful in understanding and in therapy are always in order. The nature of the subject makes difficult or impossible the experimental confirmation demanded by strict scientific method. It may well be that many of the problems of mental life must always remain in the realm of philosophy rather than of science. Psychoanalysis as a system of psychology has an important bearing on many of the biological and social sciences. Of the more immediate interest to most people is the application of its theory and practice to the problem of the neuroses. As has been stated, nervous illness is explained by Freud in accordance with the libido theory. For a person to adjust himself to life harmoniously and live at peace with himself and the world, an appropriate socialization of his instincts is essential. In psychoanalytic terminology, psychological health requires that the ego shall be in control of the libido. A person only falls ill of a neurosis when the ego loses its capacity to deal in some way with the libido. To repeat, a person only falls ill of neurosis when the ego loses its capacity to deal in some way with the libido. It is to be noted that Freud's neglect of the organic side in psychology and psychopathology is not due to repudiation of its theoretical existence. To repeat, it is to be noted that Freud's neglect of the psychoanalysis as a system of psychology has important bearing on many of the biological and social sciences. Of more immediate interest to most people is the application of its theory and practice to the problem of neuroses. As has been stated, nervous illness is explained by Freud in accordance with the libido theory. For a person to adjust himself to life harmoniously and live at peace with himself and the world, an appropriate socialization of his instincts is essential. In psychoanalytic terminology, psychological health requires that the ego shall be in control of the libido. To quote, a person only falls ill of a neurosis when the ego loses its capacity to deal in some way with the libido. It is to be noted that Freud's neglect of the organic side in psychology and psychopathology is not due to repudiation of its theoretical existence. In his writings, he refers frequently He refers frequently in passing to the probable structural and organic background of all psychic life, and in fact, a psychology of the instincts such as psychoanalysis has implicit within it an organic structural foundation. Freud's emphasis on the purely mental features results from the practical and adequate reason that an undesirable confusion is thereby avoided. A psychology which carries with it both mental and psychological physical concepts furnishes the irresistible temptation to leap nimbly back and forth between the two whenever obstacles appear across the path, and there is no coming to grips with either quarter. On this general matter, Freud states, quote, "We must recollect that all our provisional ideas in psychology will someday be placed on an organic substratum. That this makes it probable that special substances and special chemical processes control the operation of sexuality and provide for the continuation of the individual life and that of the species. We take this probability into account when we substitute special forces in the mind for special chemical substances." At this present stage of scientific knowledge, Freud agrees with other members of the functional school that to bring in hypothetical organic physiology and pathology to explain mental processes complicates theory and retards progress, with little return in the way of compensatory gain. At this point, let us from a broader philosophical standpoint sum up the psychology of Freud, accepting it as a structure erected upon the libido theory. So conceived, it must be considered to be biological, materialistic, deterministic, and it is impossible to avoid adding pessimistic. However sound and satisfactory the libido theory may appear at the start, in the logical outcome of its unfolding there is something earthly and a bit ugly at which the soul of man rebels. It sets rigid and unwelcome limitations to the significance of mankind in the scheme of things. If literally accepted, it would seem in some way to discourage those aspirations for a higher life and that inner sense of human nobility and freedom. If literally accepted, it would seem in some way to discourage those aspirations for a higher life and that inner sense of human nobility and freedom which are behind spiritual values. In view of these things are understandable the rather widespread restiveness and rebellion at the broader implications of the libido theory, even on the part of many who readily accept its enormous contributions to the field of psychology. There are needs of the human mind which the libido theory cannot satisfy on the one hand, nor on the other explain away as illusions or resistances. Happily, developments within psychoanalysis itself are apparently going to solve these perplexities. In the earlier days of the new psychology, the philosophical crisis arising from the extension of psychoanalytic theory was not so apparent, for obvious reasons. Freud and his associates were absorbed in the practical matter of understanding and treating nervous diseases. Theirs was an empirical study. As facts were established, clinical application was made of them, and working theories to explain them were formulated. The wider significance of these findings and formulations concern these men as little as it does the physicist who studies in his laboratory the forces of the inanimate world. More recently, as the broader meaning of the contributions of psychoanalytic psychology became manifest, a new growth and direction in interest and theory have solved any dilemma of repudiation on the one hand or pessimism on the other. This new field concerns the so-called ego psychology, in contrast to the libido psychology, the latter identified with the instinct life. The distinction between the two fields is fundamentally not so sharp as might appear on the surface, but for all that, the student who is more the humanist than the laboratory scientist finds a new and more satisfying orientation. Ego psychology emphasizes that part of the human personality which represses, as distinguished from that which is repressed. In contrast to the libidinal instinctive trends, which still remain the dynamic source of mental activity, the social and ethical forces of inhibition, modification, and control are given more consideration. It is seen that man is a moral being as well as an instinctual being. He is guided and ruled by something more than compulsion from outside, in that he builds up inevitably within himself ideals and inner monitors which are the origin as well as the reflection of the mores and conventions which surround him. If one may be permitted to the use of a, quote, moral scale by which to measure man, whereby libido psychology showed that he was worse than he realized, ego psychology has come to the rescue by revealing that he is far better than he dreamed. Turning once more to the neuroses, it seems often a patient is a sufferer of hypermorality rather than from any overintensity or perversion of his instincts, and that the problem for solution belongs more to the ego than to the libido. In the light of this latter ego doctrine, sexuality assumes a new relative position. It is looked upon more as manifestation than as cause. Perhaps the most important and central phase of human psychology, and certainly a standard of measurement for psychological health or illness. According to these views, Freud's axiom that with a normal sex life there can be no neuroses might be changed to a normal sex life is an index which marks the absence of a neuroses. On the matter of the moral and spiritual features of mankind, Freud comments as follows. Psychoanalysis has been reproached time after time with ignoring the higher moral spiritual side of human nature. The reproach is doubly unjust both historically and methodologically, for in the first place we have from the very beginning attributed the function of instigating repression to the moral and aesthetic tendencies in the ego. But now that we have embarked upon the analysis of the ego, we can give an answer to all those whose moral sense has been shocked and who have complained that these must surely be a higher nature in man. Quote, very true, we can say, and here we have that higher nature, this ego ideal or superego, the representative of our relation to our parents. When we were little children, we knew these higher natures, we admired them and feared them, and later we took them into ourselves. Chapter 6. The Psychoanalytic Method of Treatment. The subject of treatment can be best discussed from the standpoint of principles and of technique. The fundamental principle of procedure in psychoanalysis is to take the patient back mentally to the source of his unsolved conflicts, activate the factors once again, and aid in a new and better solution. This backwards journey is carried out simultaneously in two ways. First, intellectually by means of a reconstruction of the past through memory, and second, emotionally, by the actual experience of the analysis itself. The first means referred to is more important so far as the research side of the mental study is concerned, but the second has a much greater significance in therapy. The intellectual reconstruction of the past includes a searching autobiographical review of the whole life history. Often no material not already available to the patient is brought to light. In other cases, notably the hysterical group, the horizon of recollection is markedly extended, and many wholly forgotten incidences and attitudes appear, reaching back to very early childhood. In either case, the whole matter of life experiences and influences are newly evaluated. In addition to the conscious autobiographical study, it appears possible by inference and indirection to get at much of the unconscious mental past which is wholly inaccessible to ordinary means of investigation. This material includes, in particular, the Oedipus situation and the various patterns of reaction laid down in childhood by the family relationships in general, anomalies of which form the basis of psychoneuroses. The emotional experience of the analysis, the second means for reaching the source of old and unsolved conflicts, will be treated under the topic transference. The technique of psychoanalytic therapy is characterized by 5 features. 1. The physician maintains a relatively passive role. 2. The emotional relation between patient and physician is called transference, is put to systematic and special use. A type of thinking called free association is taught the subject and used as the main method by which he reveals the deeper content of his mind. 4. A distinctive and important use is made of dreams. 5. A minimum of attention is paid to the special symptoms which bring the patient for treatment. A minimum of attention is paid to the special symptoms which bring the patient for treatment. In contrast, consideration is given to the patient's personality as a whole. The study is directed towards the basic mental organization where lie the real difficulties, of which the symptoms are merely the surface expression. Each of these 5 features may well be considered in turn. It should be kept in mind that in both the outline and the discussion statements are oversimplified for clearness and need to be interpreted somewhat relatively. 1. The passive role. The part played by the analyst is quite in contrast to that of the guide, philosopher, and friend of traditional psychotherapy. He in no way intrudes into the external life and circumstances of the subject. He gives no advice and neither criticizes nor condones, praises nor blames. The analyst's personal affairs, his tastes, views, and philosophy of life are kept strictly in the background. His work is limited solely to assisting the patient in an interpretation of his own thoughts and feelings which arise during the course of the analytical hour. The physical arrangements in the office support the passive role of the analyst. The patient usually lies on a couch, and the analyst being seated behind and out of sight. The patient usually lies on a couch, the analyst being seated behind and out of sight. Social relations are kept at a minimum. There is no casual conversation on matters outside the analysis. At the end of a long course of treatment with all its intimacy, a subject often knows less of the personal life of the physician than he might of a new acquaintance after a brief chat. The whole procedure bears little of the nature of a discussion. It is much more monologue by the subjects who talk of whatever comes to mind. In other words, the subject thinks out loud. The analyst may offer interpretation from time to time, or he may remain silent for the whole hour. Periods of complete silence may intervene when the patient has no articulate thoughts or is reluctant to speak. The analyst is unconcerned and can wait. The subject does the work. He carries out a personality study of himself. It is impossible for him to do this alone, and the analyst is there to assist. There is little of the teacher-student relation. Rather, the situation consists of two people studying a single problem, the mind of one of them, and they are interested only in one thing, the real truth of that mind which lies beyond the ordinary disguise of everyday life. The situation consists of two people studying a single problem, the mind of one of them, and they are interested only in one thing, the real truth of that mind which lies beyond the ordinary disguise of everyday life. 2. Transference. In all successful psychotherapy, as in fact in most medical treatment, a very special emotional relationship exists between physician and patient, which is known as rapport. This rapport is by no means confined to medicine, but exists in all close relations, such as may occur between teacher and pupil, leader and follower. Without it, none of these relationships are deeply significant. When rapport is present in psychotherapy, immense power is given to the physician, sufficiently so that the patients are helped or cured quite independently of special method. From the beginning of the healing art, this power has been used to relieve symptoms, to inspire courage, to support renunciations, and to aid in bearing burdens. Much of the time, effects have been gained without the physician's being aware of the power he was wielding. The blindness to the meaning of rapport on the part of the medical profession has been nothing short of extraordinary. The force which it represents has been better grasped by the quack healer, who knows that by it he can influence people quite regardless of the worth of his professed agency of cure. Certain medical men have seen fit to disparage the rapport feature in therapy as unscientific and savoring of chicanery. Certain medical men have seen fit to disparage the rapport feature in therapy as unscientific and savoring of chicanery. Others appear to fear it as dangerous, and still others exalt some special method of treatment quite oblivious to the existence of the rapport element which gives it life. If it were necessary to choose between method and rapport in psychotherapy, there is little question that the latter would be the more useful agency. If psychoanalysis had done nothing more in a practical way than to make its contribution to the subject of rapport, designated by Freud transference, it would have well justified itself. The attempt has been made by psychoanalysis to study and standardize these important and powerful phenomena of transference, to harness them, so to speak, and to make them available in a systematic and controlled way for psychotherapy. To be sure, no one knows what rapport consists in. No wonder the scientific world is shy. There is magic and mystery in it. Its absence leaves words of logic and wisdom fruitless and sterile. Its presence may make these same words potent and for influence. Personality with a capital P is the word popularly applied to the special mysterious something in the physician which makes possible the easy establishment of rapport. Accompanying this term is often the implication of the dynamic, authoritative, and dominant person who is always the leader of any field and activity. In the transference situation of analysis, it has been shown no special type of personality is essential to gain rapport. The quiet, less assertive individual seems as well able to play the part as his more robust-minded brother. Apparently, what the neurotic person longs for is understanding, and when he finds it in a professional relationship, a satisfactory rapport can be easily enough established, either with or without a sense of leaning on a mastermind. In much of the usual psychotherapy, a permanent relation tends to be established. The patient orients his life towards the physician and looks to him for inspiration and guidance. The rapport connection remains a permanent one, even if direct contact is rare. Janet refers to the physician's part in this relation as directorship. We all know people who are directed in such a way by a physician or someone in another capacity. This is often a necessary and perfectly good arrangement, but it is not the method of psychoanalysis. In psychoanalysis, the power of rapport is employed in a different and special way. It is not used to guide the patient or immediately to affect his symptoms. It is directed towards enabling him to carry out a study of his own mental life. The first step in this process is to bring to the surface trains of thought ordinarily automatically repressed, which bear strong and painful effect. Special timidities, fears, disloyalties, aversions, and so on, jealousy guarded by the neurotic even from himself in real life, are given immense relief by this ventilation. The patient so sensitive towards criticism or disapproval is comforted by finding in the physician one who accepts without appraisal. The patient so sensitive towards criticism or disapproval is comforted by finding in the physician one who accepts without appraisal and shows equal interest and tolerance for the strong features and the weak, the good and the bad. The patient learns that after all, he may not be so different from other people. His inferiority is lightened, he feels hope, and his attitude towards the analysis is that at least he has found what he has been looking for, someone to understand him. This long sought-for goal he thoroughly believes to consist in recovery from his illness. As a matter of fact, it is much more justification without conflict of his present level of adjustment for which he strives, and the knotty problem in therapy is to substitute for this latter palliative procedure a more constructive reorganization of function. In any case, the preliminary stage binds the subject still more firmly in the analytic situation. As a second step, he begins to experience rather than remember his past. That is, certain parts of the past become reanimated and he lives them over again. With this, what Freud chooses to call transference neurosis develops, which means that for the time being, the subject shifts some of his conflicts and difficulties from the problems of the past and of his usual world to the analytic relationship. The matter of the transference situation in analysis is difficult to describe, but not so difficult to experience, either as subject or as analyst. Freud speaks of the general tendency of human beings to transfer, meaning that all men have a need for understanding, sympathy, support, and so on, which is never wholly fulfilled in ordinary human relationships, with the result that there is a constant reaching out for a more complete satisfaction. This universal need and longing furnish no doubt a foundation for much of the religious tendency of mankind. Whatever the case may be with normal individuals, it is plain to the neurotic tends strongly to transfer. He brings into all his contacts with people childish and undeveloped emotional needs and strivings carried over from the past, which are doomed to be thwarted and violated in a normal adult world. Even if these needs, egocentric as they are, were in themselves capable of satisfaction, the fact that he must deal with other people, each with his own special demands, and perhaps no better prepared than the patient himself, spells continual disappointment. Furthermore, these arrested emotional trends of the neurotic are by their very nature conflicting and incompatible. There is lacking the unity and integration of the normal personality. What satisfies one part violates another, and he is forced to a continual state of repression, inhibition, control, and compromise. This conflict of demand may be illustrated by the not unfamiliar type of neurotic who longs to find in all his contacts with those in authority the image of the protective father whom he can lean. Actually, in such relationships, his own independence and manliness rise in protest at the subjugation which he creates for himself, and on the surface his final attitude may be more that of defiance than dependence. The neurotic is for the most part unaware of these conflicting inner trends. He only knows that he feels isolated in a world of people and suffers from symptoms and dissatisfaction. The analytical situation developing during the analysis is to a certain extent artificially constructed to make it possible to bring up into the open these undeveloped, inadequate, and conflicting needs in a way that cannot be accomplished elsewhere. The analysis is a one-sided relationship in marked contrast with those of the real world of daily living, or for that matter, of the ordinary professional relationship. This one-sidedness permits the subject to set aside the usual social veneer of his mental life and to come for the time being near to the real self underlying the everyday official personality. For the first time in his life, he can reanimate his childhood without fear of external criticism. Freed from the necessity for artifice and control, he repeats the past in fantasies and attitudes in the analysis. Instead of recalling old patterns of reaction, he relives them during the analytic sessions. From this experience, a patient suitably selected is enabled to see himself as he really is, to realize the inadequacy of his emotional preparation for adult living, and to grasp the impossibility of satisfying some of his demands. By means of this combination of experiencing and understanding, he is able to revise in terms of adulthood some of his infantile strivings and to dismiss in light of adult knowledge his crushing internal verdicts on crimes of infantile imagination. The analysis gives him the opportunity for something of a laboratory sampling of his whole life, expressed in words instead of action, and quite free and apart from the need of maintaining responsibility and control, which in ordinary living he dare not relax. The analyst acts in this laboratory setting less as an individual than as a composite phantom figure of the childhood past, in its family setting, and towards this figure are reactivated all the main relationships which have played a formative part in the patient's life. Not all of this is seen as clearly as outlined above. Either the subject or analyst. Part of it appears distinctly in conscious awareness and in actual emotional reactions toward the analyst. Much of it goes on beneath the surface and is only grasped by indirection through dreams and so on. In other words, the transference relation exists both consciously and unconsciously, and, like other relations of real life, at times the two attitudes are in accord and at times diametrically opposed. The ambivalent and ununified emotional life of the neurotic is revealed in transference with its positive and negative features. On the one side are need, dependence, and a reaching out. On the other are withdrawal, hostility, and resentment. One side or the other may be seen on the surface, but the opposite is usually active on deeper levels. Over and over in this analytic experience, patients relive and thereby reveal important parent-child or other early relationships left unresolved, buried in the unconscious, and carried over to adulthood, to condition all later reactions with people. Thus is accomplished by a controlled experiment in actual living what would defy an understanding by objective study and intellectual approach. Put in another way, each individual during his psychic growth constructs patterns of emotional response which comprise his equipment for adaptation to the situations which will confront him. If these patterns of reaction are adequate, he has no need of analysis. If they are badly formed or insufficient, then analysis is one means for searching them out and reconstructing them. The patient brings these patterns to the analytic situation as to all other human relationships. There are, as in no other place they can be seen clearly, their inadequacy can be recognized fully, and the opportunity to modify them to a more useful type is made uniquely available. Part of the analyst training is to be emotionally untouched himself by this transference relation. Otherwise, it becomes a human problem for the patient like any other, and the deeper revelation sought for is defeated. The analyst must be as immune to criticism, hostility, and even insult on the one hand, as to deification or adoration on the other. In analysis, all these attitudes are reflections of deeper complex motives and sources which the analyst patiently and steadfastly seeks to uncover. He recognizes full well that it is less as an individual than as a symbol and substitute that he is functioning. He is permitting himself, as it were, to be used as a foil, in order that the patient may thereby get in deeper touch with his own mental life. The analyst's passivity and refusal to enter into any reality relationships, even to the extent of a friendly argument, enables the patient to arrive at a convincing emotional realization of the persistent infantile tendencies responsible for his neuroses. It is not so difficult to establish a transference. If the patient continues the treatment, he does that of his own accord. To do away with the transference is a more difficult but equally important procedure. The analysis is not complete until the patient has freed himself from the transference situation. That is, until he has given up the analyst as an object of very special significance in his own emotional life. In a sense, it may be said that the goal of the analysis is to teach the patient to build up a relationship with the analyst on an adult rather than on an infantile plane. This accomplished, he can go back to the ordinary world of men better prepared to carry on the same level in other human contexts. 3. Free association. Free association is a method of thinking in a marked distinction to that ordinarily carried on, even in the most idle fantasy or daydreaming. In ordinary thinking, there is a constant automatic tendency to eliminate the unpleasant or difficult. This is not always possible, so that often painful lines of thought take possession of the mind. Frequently, this reaches obsessional intensity, and a train of futile and unpleasant thinking repeats itself indefinitely. In free association, the subject is encouraged to permit his mind to be passive and undirected, and in this state to put into words as well as he can the thoughts, pictures, and feelings that drift through. It is emphasized that everything belongs in the analysis, no matter how disconnected, irrelevant, trivial, personal, or unpleasant. This procedure, of course, requires the complete cooperation of the patient, and the ability to acquire competence differs markedly. Most subjects can gain a sufficient degree of proficiency to make the method a practical one. In the familiar word association test, Jung has attempted to standardize the free association method. This special application has found a useful place in experimental psychology, although at present less often employed in ordinary clinical procedure. Criticism has been offered that free association and analysis is not free, but is determined by special conditions, including the personality of the analyst. This criticism is no doubt sound, but free or not, the method described enables the individual to go deep into his own mind. The term free association remains, if one pleases, as a convenient misnomer to designate a special process. It is found that wherever the starting point may be, free association progresses finally towards the fundamental problems of the maladjusted person, which as a rule lies far too deep to be available by any direct approach. The routes of free association are circuitous, with wide detours and frequent retracing of steps, but always, if persisted in, they lead in the direction of the problems sought. Without some experience in free association, one is unaware of the lack of freedom in the usual thinking, to say nothing of talking. As an illustration may be used the attitude of an individual towards a friend, even if the occasion for such an analysis is difficult to imagine. The conscious attitude is one of interest, affection, and loyalty, but this is the final integration of many elements which go to make up the whole. Some of these elements are probably quite at variance with the final common path of friendship. Jealousies, malice, distrust, and resentment may have a place, though not important enough to offset the stronger and more desirable feelings. To repeat the section, without some experience in free association, one is unaware of the lack of freedom in the usual thinking, to say nothing of talking. As an illustration may be used the attitude of an individual towards a friend, even if the occasion for such an analysis is difficult to imagine. The conscious attitude is one of interest, affection, and loyalty, but this is the final integration of many elements which go to make up a whole. Some of these elements are probably quite at variance with the final common path of friendship. Jealousies, malice, distrust, and resentment may have a place, though not important enough to offset the stronger and more desirable feelings. Ordinary thinking tries to dismiss and eliminate these discordant notes. Free association tends to bring them up to the surface. A natural question arises as to why there should be any attempt to unearth underlying partial and discarded components of mental attitudes. The question is that no reason exists save one, namely, that such disharmonious trends are the cause of neurotic or other difficulty, and in such case, there is a good chance that they can be handled better if made conscious and brought into the open than if left buried alive in the depths of the mind. That the inevitable goal of free associative thinking should be some phase of the most important life problems seems clear enough. Certainly it is true with the more obvious problems of external life. If a man had recently suffered financial disaster and was asked to be quite passive mentally and to think of the North Pole or some other neutral matter, it would not be long in his associations before his misfortunes came to mind. Perhaps it is only a difference in degree from what is seen when the thoughts of a neurotic, wherever they start, drift towards some manifestation of the repressed, unconscious, unsolved psychic aftermath of infantile conflict, which is his real problem of today. It proves to be a fact that thoughts in free association, however disconnected and unimportant they may seem to be, are joined together by threads of connection located in the unconscious mind, which give bias and direction. In this method, sooner or later, deeper layers of mental functioning are progressively revealed. 4. The use of dreams. The subject of the meaning of dreams and their use in psychoanalytic theory need to be discussed here, but briefly. Suffice it to say that, according to the Freudian theory, dreams are a more direct expression of the unconscious mental life than are any other psychic phenomena. This expression is in symbolic form for the purpose both of condensing material and of protecting the dreamer from conscious recognition of certain repressed mental processes set free in the dream, which would be disturbing in one way or another if undisguised. Based on this relationship to the unconscious, dreams prove to offer a more direct access to the deeper levels than do other manifestations of a subject's mental life. They may be used in two ways, either as a starting point for free associative method of thought, or by direct interpretation of the dream to reveal the unconscious mental states behind it. Interpretation of dreams is somewhat risky procedure in that it is hard to draw a fast line between sound fact and specious fancy. It is no doubt true that there are many levels for meaning of dreams and that they can best be interpreted by taking into account their relation to the whole problem, which is being studied. Certain types of dreams and simple standard symbolization are possible exceptions to this rule, and the significance of such dreams is fairly generally accepted, except where the Freudian dream theory is repudiated altogether. Free association, in relation to the dream element, appears to give the method the advantage of a shortcut in analytical procedure. As a rule, neurotic patients have dreams, but occasionally there is an exception. In such event, the analysis has to go on without this advantageous material. This usually offers something of a handicap, but in no way prohibits a successful analysis. At the present day, the use of dreams for diagnostic and therapeutic purposes is by no means confined to psychoanalysis and is emphasized in some degree by modern psychiatry in general. 5. Management of symptoms. 5. Management of symptoms. Naturally, the patient's mind is at first full of his own symptoms and more acute problems. Analysis, to a considerable extent, must ignore them. It has as its object something more than the different from direct relief from symptoms, good as such treatment may be in certain cases. It is assumed, of course, that analysis employs common sense as well as special method, and there may be exceptions to rule. It is taken for granted also that before analysis is undertaken, organic basis for physical symptoms is eliminated by competent medical study, and that there is no crisis in the external circumstances of a patient's life which cannot wait for settlement until the analysis is over. Usually, the lack of comment on the part of the analyst leads the patient to drift away from the subject of symptoms. It seems that for the most part it takes two to keep a topic going. If nothing else comes to the patient's mind, his annoyance, perplexity, or grievance at the analyst's attitude is made manifest and a new line of thought is started. Occasionally, symptoms are so intrusive and monopolize the mind so completely that they cannot be ignored. If these are physical matters, the patient is referred to a medical colleague. If there is need for advice in matters of daily life, some other outsider can best be turned to. It is well that both have some sympathetic viewpoint towards the analyst. towards the analysis. With the responsibility of these matters shifted to others, the analysis can then proceed. Symptoms and current problems are of interest chiefly as they bear on the patient's personality organization as a whole, with its conflicts and difficulties revealed by reactions in the analytical situation. The following example will illustrate both the matter of free association and the management of distressing symptoms which obstruct analysis. A young man has been under analysis for a severe anxiety neurosis. Among his symptoms was a fear that pieces of food or glass would become lodged in his throat. This phobia led to all sorts of food prohibitions and the necessity for repeated daily reassurance from family and physicians. On principle, the analyst declined to give special attention to these symptoms, leaving the patient quite free to return to his former sources of support. In spite of this arrangement, these symptoms so filled his mind that no other material was available. Hour after hour, he maneuvered to get the analyst to take the role of authority and to reassure him. His distress was no less acute on account of complete insight into the lack of basis for his fear and a realization that the analysis was being obstructed. One interview was discontinued, and the analyst's suggestion the patient went rather shamefacedly to consult a laryngologist. During this examination, he was able to see the humor of having his throat looked into for something he knew quite well was not there. At the next hour of analysis, the patient discouragingly announced, after a period of silence, that all he could think of was that a peanut was stuck in his throat. He was asked to let his mind be passive and to continue thinking of his throat. Immediately, a scene from his childhood was recalled. He had entered his parents' bedroom, and both of them were scantily clad. His father reproved him sharply, and the boy felt anger and resentment. This long-forgotten scene, coming to his mind in such connection, caused the young man astonishment. The throat symptom was lost sight of for the time, and he talked of other events of his boyhood. The relationship between the throat phobia and the family emotional drama of childhood, illustrated by this bedroom scene, later became clear enough. During the interview, the two topics were joined by a thread of free association on account of the common element of anxiety. The anxiety had its roots of origin in the deep mental conflict resulting from an unsolved Oedipus problem. By devious routes, it had reached the surface and had become displaced on to the throat symptoms. During analysis, the underlying causal situation gradually came near to consciousness. The instant of free association resulted from a reversal of dynamics. That is, the anxiety was shifted back again away from the symptom toward its real source. It should hardly be necessary to add that this simple illustration furnishes a hint rather than any complete explanation of the problems of anxiety in neurosis. Chapter 7. Further discussion of psychoanalytic treatment. In dealing with nervous illness, one is faced with the strange and paradoxical fact that the patient clings to his neurosis as though he did not wish to get well. He suffers often enough, he complains bitterly, and he is unhappy. He sacrifices time and money for treatment. He longs for health and freedom, and protests his willingness to make every effort, yet unmistakably he defends himself adroitly against therapeutic influence and holds to his symptom as though they were something precious. This instinctive opposition to medical aid is called resistance by psychoanalysts. The novice in psychotherapy is apt to be much annoyed by the phenomenon of resistance. The patient does not want to be helped. Does not want to be helped? Very well, tell him in no uncertain terms what you think of him and give up the case. More careful consideration of the nature of nervous disorder makes less puzzling the resistance which is set up against therapeutic attempts. A neurotic illness is no accident. It marks the failure to stand up before the demands of life as the direct consequence of inadequate psychological preparedness. The normal man has worked out the best plan of mental organization that he can in order to avoid pain and achieve satisfaction. For the most part, he knows and cares little about his inner mental life. The whole thing operates with as little relation to consciousness as does the digestion of a healthy boy. But somewhere the normal man has a useful scheme of values, emotional needs capable of satisfaction in a grown-up world, and some workable philosophy of life. After all, in general policy, the neurotic has done no differently from other men. He too has constructed his scheme of life to avoid pain and achieve satisfaction. The fact that his scheme has broken down makes it no less his own, the best under all the circumstances that he could do for himself, and it seems to him the lesser of two evils when compared to any alternative. Consciously, he recognizes his difficulties and is ready to change. Unconsciously, he holds with might and main to the status quo. To be asked to let down repressions which have been so painstakingly built up, to hold up an undeveloped emotional life in control, strikes panic to his soul. It seems to him far safer to hold to the evils that he has than to fly to those he knows not of. Something akin to that described above is, in a general way, the main theme in resistance. Many other secondary factors enter in. For example, there is the so-called gain from illness, where symptoms appear to gratify impulse needs substitutively, even though at the same time they cause distress in other ways. Also, the transference situation itself produces a special and stubborn resistance in the nature of an attempt to find in this new relationship a comfortable and protected existence which is threatened by recovery. In this case, a ready compliance with the analysis may obscure from both patient and physician the underlying situation. At times the resistance is so unyielding that there is little chance of breaking through. This is true in paranoid states and the major hypochondriases, and in lesser degree hypochondriac cases, and in lesser degree apply to some obsessional neuroses. In other cases, the gain from illness is too practical and obvious to be lightly set aside. This is evident in that type of neurotic who by his symptoms has acquired special privilege and freedom from obligation. Appropriately chooses cases for analysis must be those less rigidly organized than the paranoid and with more robust qualities of personality than the one who is a neurotic for special privilege. With these, the central point of analytical art is to break down resistances. Resistances rather than complexes are what the analysis is ever seeking to discover. Just so far as these can be removed, is it possible to get at and modify the underlying psychic state from which spring the roots of the neuroses. Resistance, therefore, is always present in analysis. If none is evident, then beware. It is operating under some new and unrecognized disguise. Neurotics, like other people, are very much alike, and there are many standard manifestations of resistance. Some of the more familiar are exaggerated criticism and skepticism of the analysis, based on something other than the merits or demerits of the case. Plain boredom at the tediousness of the process is not uncommon. As already noted, physical symptoms may intrude themselves so forcefully in the patient's mind that there is no room for other material. Depression or anxiety may reach such intensity that no analysis is possible till some relief is forthcoming. Often the patient ingeniously attempts to intellectualize the analysis, to lift it to the level of objective discussion, or he tries to turn the tables and analyze the analyst. Again, he may suddenly cease dreaming, or on the other hand bring such a confusion of dreams that the very mass of them defies analytic consideration. One adroit bit of super-resistance is rapid recovery. The patient feels quite well again. He is interested and appreciative of the analysis. He will recommend it to his friends, but there is no need of continuing in his own case. Selective amnesias of all sorts occur. Material or interpretations of special significance are repeatedly forgotten in a way difficult to credit without actual experience. The use of wit to avoid direct issues is not unfamiliar. In the matter of free association, resistance may show itself by complete inability on the one hand, or on the other by endless and footless rambling in self-indulgent fantasy. Resistance brings analytic procedure to repeated states of stagnation. Occasionally there is no passing by, and the analysis must be discontinued. More often, with a suitable patient, the analysis is able to point out resistance, and if this explanation is in any way accepted, the deadlock relaxes and the analysis proceeds, the patient falling back, as it were, to still other positions of resistance, where the same process of overcoming must be repeated. At times, the analysis from his experience in his detached position sees these points of resistance clearly. At others, he, like the patient, is groping forward for a period in the dark. These barriers of resistance, which must be one by one removed, are present in every analysis and at times stand out with extraordinary clearness and naivety. A young woman sought treatment after many years of unexplained chronic invalidism, plus a distressing self-consciousness and sense of inferiority. She had by no means surrendered wholly to her difficulties and made repeat attempts to take part in normal life, always resulting in failure and new disappointment. Resistance to the analysis was obvious and profound. She was sensitive to the slightest questioning as to a possible psychological basis for her symptoms. Comment by the analysis for the most part seemed to her like criticism, while she was equally intolerant of attitudes which could be construed as sympathetic. At first she was antagonistic to analytical procedure, and general free association was silly. What came to her mind in such a way was unimportant. The whole thing was much ado about nothing. Now, if this had been her whole reaction, of course she would not have continued to keep her appointments and persist in the treatment. Something more of interest and hope was present than showed on the surface. After a time it was revealed that she was continually fearful of breaking down and crying in the presence of the analyst, or of appearing to desire sympathy, both of which situations seemed equally unendurable. This fear at first was unknown to the patient, as of course it was to the analyst. It was completely obscured behind her critical viewpoint of much ado about nothing. A little later it became evident that if she let her mind take its course in free association, her thoughts inevitably turned towards her father, whose weakness, foibles, and dominance had been ever present and determining influence. These thoughts brought swift self-punishment in the sense of disloyalty and guilt, from which she had been protecting herself by the much ado about nothing, and the dread of weeping in the analysis. Still later, the connection with the father topic, she became aware of vigorous feelings of hatred at what she felt was his interference with her life, feelings buried by other attitudes of which she had never before been really conscious. And so the patient continued in the analysis, removing, so to speak, layer after layer of resistance, becoming gradually able to face each uncovered attitude with less conflict and distress, and moving on to another with repetition of the whole process, but with each step a little nearer to the realization and acceptance of her real self, until then hidden deep behind the rigid barriers of the defense neurosis. The physician cannot accomplish for his patients this removal of resistances. He can only help make it possible for them to do it themselves. In the consideration of resistance, there is one important error to be avoided. It would be a great mistake to see in resistance simply an unwelcome obstacle across the path of progress towards health, a kind of stubborn negativism towards being guided in the direction one should go. There is another side to resistance. There is a vigor and self-assertiveness in it which can by no means be dismissed as undesirable. Best stated, it may perhaps be said that the motive behind resistance is good, and that ill effects are to be considered more in the nature of misdirection of a tendency to independence than as a manifestation of weakness and defect. The vigor of resistance, like that of the original repression, of which in a sense it is the current equivalent, marks the individual's attempt at self-determination and at making the best adjustment to life that he can. The aim of therapy, therefore, is not to rob him of this vigor of assertiveness and self-sufficiency, but to make it possible for him to turn it to constructive ends rather than be forced to waste it in evasive and defense against inner dangers so often more fictitious than real. During the treatment hours, the patient, so far as is possible, gives up self-direction of thought, lets his mind drift, and by means of speech empties its contents, so to speak, into the analysis. The analyst listens to the material, subjects it to the test of his own trained mind, objectively related to the problem, and attempts to determine what motives and elements lie behind. The patient complains that the analyst ignores the obvious, is suspicious of everything, and seeks deep and hidden meanings. The charge is true. In the neurotic, things are not what they seem, and it is the business of analysis to question everything. At times meanings are clear, very often they are obscure. Positive interpretation when things are plain, and a questioning attitude when they are obscure, seem to make it possible for the patient to shed layer after layer of disguise and come nearer and nearer to the real problem of his mental life. Even questioning the hypothesis proved later to be quite off the track apparently do no harm, and in a properly conducted analysis, the patient himself sifts the wheat from the chaff. The detail of analytic technique is changing, and will change much more. Among other things, the single fact that the most educated people are informed on psychoanalytic theory has made for revision of method. Formerly a memory reconstruction of life history and the revealing of formative mental mechanisms took first place. In this, causal features of the pathology were given first consideration. Now the emphasis is laid more on the analytic situation compounded of transference and resistance, that is, the emotional experience rather than the intellectual one. The analysis furnishes, as it were, a small edition of the emotional life history of the subject, the inadequacies of which he learns through actual repetition. It is a truism that one cannot live his life a second time. In some respects, an analytic experience seems an exception to this rule. Certain poorly developed features of the emotional life are lived through a second time, and thereby the subject is given another opportunity to do better with them. A therapeutic analysis takes much time, 6 months to a year, or more of daily interviews is common. It is not difficult to see that the time element is important. The method is educational rather than inspirational or conversational. And education takes time. For practical reasons, however, everything that shortcuts analytical procedure without sacrifice of accomplishment must be welcomed, and steps have been made in that direction. The most time-consuming feature of analysis is the bringing back to the patient's memory his early life history plus its reconstruction and reevaluation. This part is of fundamental importance in research analysis, and Freud maintains that it is essential for proper therapy. He states, quote, "In my own writings and in those of my followers, more and more stress is laid upon the necessity of carrying the analysis of neurotics back to the remotest period of their childhood, the time of which sexual life reaches the climax of its early development. It is only by examining the first manifestation of the patient's instinctual constitutions and the effects of his earliest experiences that we can accurately gauge the motive forces that have led to his neurosis and can be secure against the errors into which we might be tempted by the degree to which they have become remodeled and overlaid in adult life." Diagnostic analysis is often relatively simple. In many cases, after a few interviews, the analyst grasps some of the more general features of psychopathology involved. This is nothing strange. After all, the main fundamental themes of human life are few, and the general lines of difficulty are much the same. But what the physician knows or thinks helps the patient very little. Somewhat as in music or the fine arts in general, so in the art of mental adjustments, what a second person knows is only of value in helping the other to gain by his own experience. The matter, however simple in theoretical formulation, cannot be imparted by word of mouth. Finally, then, as to the significance of psychoanalytic treatment, it is the belief of its advocates that the patient is given a unique and carefully worked out opportunity to change the emotional dependence to emotional independence and to grow from his state of childishness to one near adulthood. His personality is organized on an imperfect but rigidly crystallized basis. Analysis is an attempt to reach deep down, to loosen or liquefy this structure and to make possible thereby a reorganization on a new and better level. Massive experience in real life occasionally accomplishes the same thing. A great love, some deep religious awakening, a sudden demand for duty and sacrifice, or a self-obliterating social movement, such as a holy war, may, as it were, lift an individual bodily from his own difficulties and leave him a changed man. Obviously, the mass of neurotic and maladjusted people are not going to be cured by such an accident of circumstance. Analysis is an attempt to accomplish by systematic, standardized, controllable procedure what cannot be well left to the uncertain fate of spontaneous growth. Chapter 8. Summary of Psychoanalytic Treatment. It seems pertinent at this point to sum up the aim and object of psychoanalytic treatment. The purpose in psychoanalytic treatment is to establish a special emotional relationship between analyst and patient, which for the time being takes an important place in the latter's life. This relationship is called transference. One may turn for illustration to the absorption of the adolescent in a summer at camp, of the youth in his first year at college, or in the adult in a love affair. While the part played by an analysis may be much less obvious than these outstanding life experiences, still, in a sense, it takes for a period a central place in the subject's emotional life. For the neurotic, Freud calls this shifting of interest a transference neurosis. By this, he means that difficulties and conflicts, heritage and aftermath of unsolved relationships of childhood are transferred out of the past into the present. The center of gravity, so to speak, of the subject's maladjustments is moved from the childhood past to the analytic situation of the present. In a way, this same thing occurs in all important relationships of the adult. To friend, employer, spouse, and so on. The analytical relationship differs simply in that it is so constructed as to make the transference more complete and more transparent. The analysis is a one-sided affair in the sense that the physician plays a relatively passive and impersonal part, and the reality situation characteristic of other contemporary relationships is at a minimum. The analyst is more a phantom figure than a real person of the present, a composite picture made up of parental images and other earlier human contacts from which the patient has never gained normal emancipation. For this reason, the age, sex, social attributes, and type of personality of the analyst play but a secondary role. Towards this figure of the analyst, in the setting of the specially created analytic situation, the subject reactivates old patterns of reaction in a manner to become manifest to him as never before, and in favorable cases there results from a combination of desire and necessity a reorganization of his emotional life on a new and better level. The patient is inadequately equipped emotionally for smooth adaptation in his dealings with his fellow beings. He has childish needs and strivings, undesirable legacies from the past, which in the better adjusted person have been resolved and left behind in the process of normal psychological growth. To repeat, the patient is inadequately equipped emotionally for smooth adaptation in his dealings with his fellow beings. He has childish needs and strivings, undesirable legacies from the past, which in the better adjusted person has been resolved and left behind in the process of normal psychological growth. The underdeveloped emotional attitudes are brought by the neurotic person to all his human relationships, love, friendship, and business, as well as in wider social fields. In all of these contexts, certain of his needs are thwarted and denied. For the most part, the nature of these deprivations is hidden from the individual himself and from the others with whom he deals. But nonetheless, they hamper and complicate his attempts at adjustment. The neurotic constantly craves and seeks for satisfactions which the world of adult reality within or without cannot satisfy. And he is doomed to disappointment. He is doomed to disappointment over and over, repeated, all the more disturbing because he is unaware of its nature. The patterns of emotional strivings are brought to light in analysis as they can never be in any other relationship for reasons obvious enough. A few simple examples will illustrate. Undercurrents of hate, which so often complicate for the neurotic his feelings of friendship, love, and admiration, must be denied expression in real life, to say nothing of conscious realization, in order to avoid ruining an actual love relation or friendship. In an analysis, the goal of self-direction and control is reversed. Instead of a premium on denial and non-realization of negative reactions, they are invited into the open. Irritation or adoration, criticism or flattery, ridicule or affection can be brought into analysis without affecting it in any way by the standards of social values. In a manner impossible for a person in any other situation, the analyst is emotionally untouched. He recognizes at all times that he is playing chiefly the part of a foil for the patient, as the qualities and traits for the latter's real self released by the analysis come out from behind the disguise of the surface personality. The analyst can have neither his feelings hurt nor his self-esteem exalted. He is only interested in the motive and meaning of attitudes as they are more and more freely disclosed, as pure curiosity. As another example, the dependent child relationship, the so-called analytic love needs also present in the neurotic would be unbearable to the more independent side of the subject if realized by him in such a relationship to a chief or employer. In the analysis, however, this overdependency can be more easily revealed, accepted if necessary, as part of the game, a means to an end, and not too much a matter of humiliation. And so it goes with all the deep-lying, repressed, dimly conscious or unconscious emotional attitudes of the subject. Gradually in the analysis he sees them spread clearly before him. Gradually and apparently, always reluctantly, he realizes the impossibility of any straightforward satisfaction in the world of adult reality without a change of his demands. Gradually he modifies and discards some of his inadequate material for life and faces the world again after the analysis better equipped than before to adjust himself to things, as they are without the need of neurotic compromise. All this is no easy task. No matter how cooperative and eager for help the neurotic person may be on the surface, there is an underlying inertia and opposition to the mental changes which will make him well. The vigor of this resistance towards recovery brings astonishment and perplexity to the novice in the field of psychotherapy. A deeper understanding, however, makes these phenomena less obscure. Most of the psychic material involved in neurosis exists outside the realm of consciousness and thereby is immune to the action of choice and self-direction. In fact, it is little affected in any way by logic or reason from without or from within. The psychic organization of the neurotic, with all its defects, has been constructed with a purpose, namely to avoid pain and to hold fast to satisfactions already gained. It differs from that of the normal only in degree. For some reason, in the childhood unconscious of the neurotic, fear of the future and reluctance to relinquish the seeming peace and security of the present have more intense and more determinant of the adult personality. As it stands, the plan of the neurotic's mental life represents the habit of a lifetime and is the result of an inner conditioning which gives tenacity and persistence. If from it all there has resulted for the patient conflict and maladjustment, at the same time it seems to him the least of evils as contrasted with alternatives. Less wonder, then, that he clings to his scheme of mental organization, neurosis and all, as though he were threatened with the loss of something precious, or if he were asked to give up security and plunge into a menacing unknown. In the light of psychoanalytic conceptions of the problem of neurosis, its special method of therapy becomes a systematic procedure established to accomplish certain definite ends. A. The first is to dislodge and recondition certain inadequate and handicapping features of the unconscious mental life. B. A second end is to reduce the deep-lying fear and guilt which have hampered and distorted psychological growth and development. C. It is also necessary to arouse a desire for independence and to force the realization of the futility of trying to appease infantile needs in an adult world. Such realization means something far more than mere intellectual understanding and requires emotional insight and conviction. And D. Last and by no means least important, before the end of treatment the patient must be emancipated from the transference relation to the analyst. This emotional bond has furnished the central agency for accomplishing the desired changes, but carries the danger of simply shifting from an old bondage to a new one if the dependence on the physician is held to as a way of life rather than as a means of therapy. The patient, by the influence of the analysis, has been persuaded to give up an emotional anchorage in his childhood past and achieve a substitute one in the analytical situation itself. A second step of even greater significance must be made. Once more he must renounce an undesirable and compromised adjustment, this time in the analysis, and be launched forth to make terms with the real world. In this world of reality, an appropriately chosen patient, his powers strengthened by the aid of the analysis, has the opportunity to make a normal adjustment as a final substitution and release both from the childhood complications which imprisoned him in neurosis and from the experience of the analysis which has set him free. A number of questions naturally arise concerning psychoanalysis. A. What is its relation to other systems of psychotherapy? B. How far can the method described be modified and still lay claim to being psychoanalytic in nature? C. For what type of patients is this means of treatment desirable? A. Psychotherapy has been practiced since earliest times, appearing in various guises, and is often outside the medical profession as within it. Until the present century, the methods employed by medical men were largely individual. Formerly, the physician interested in such matters might well be at a loss when confronted with the problem of psychological illness. He found himself approaching the matter of therapy equipped with only a few very general medical principles and forced to rely on his intuitive sense of how one person may influence another. In this instance, from sickness towards health, stern authority, kindly interest, wise counsel, philosophies of life, spiritual uplift, and it must be added a sprinkling of magic were in various proportions contributed to the therapeutic task. To be sure, after 1850 more systematic methods of psychotherapy were developed than had been known before. But with the exception of hypnotic suggestion, comparatively little of the work was clearly defined or in any way standardized. It should be understood that this fact in no way reflects on the efficacy of method. In individual cases, it does mean, however, that until recent years, psychotherapy existed mainly as an individualistic art, in small degree affected by the general scientific progress so evident in other fields of medicine. In small degree affected by the general scientific progress so evident in other fields of medicine. The psychotherapist was still depended chiefly on his own inner resources. There was no source from which he could get orderly training, and his own ideas and special systems developed from experience were too poorly formulated to enable him to teach others. However effective a physician might be in treating psychic maladies, his work bore little relation to the past and had small influence on the future. As a rule, it began and ended with his own career in active practice. It must be a matter of regret that with the great men of medicine, the immortality given to their work in physical science and general culture could not have included that part of their art of psychotherapy which must have contained common material and been based on universals. Psychoanalytic treatment is distinct in many ways from other types of psychotherapy. 1. It is more nearly standardized. 2. The emotional relationship of patient to physician, so-called rapport or transference, is understood on a far deeper level than formerly, and the recognition and manipulation of this transference furnish the main agency in therapy. 3. A much less important part is played by the physician's personality in the popular sense of the term. And 4. The method is one that can be taught in theory and practice. B. There are various methods of psychoanalytic treatment, all based on the same underlying principles, but differing somewhat in the superstructure of theory and the technique of application. One of these methods is the Freudian, so called from being more closely allied to that practiced and taught by Freud himself, and differing from the procedures employed by others of his followers, particularly the group led by Jung. In the Freudian method, the analyst keeps a relatively more detached and impersonal status. In the Freudian method, the analyst keeps a relatively more detached and impersonal status. The object striven for is to aid the patient in the removal of inner obstacles to normal mental adjustment. In other words, there is the attempt to help the patient break through his repressions and to bring the unconscious mental conflicts responsible for his neuroses near enough to the surface to be solved in a new and more desirable manner than before. In order not to detract from this main purpose, advice and guidance in the ordinary sense are kept at a minimum, and attention is focused on the intrapsychic life of the subject. If he needs direction and support, he can best get them elsewhere. Jung refers to the foregoing as the caustic method, and maintains, no doubt with good grounds, that in certain cases more needs to be accomplished than the removal of intrapsychic obstacles. The caustic method, he considers, should apply rather exclusively to robust youth, where there is plentiful opportunity ahead for satisfaction in real life. For older people, or those more limited in capacity or opportunity, he urges as a supplement to the removal of obstacles that treatment be directed to mobilizing the latent resources within the self. Certain psychic potentials, hitherto dwarfed and inhibited by neurotic barriers, he feels need arousing by the leadership and inspiration of the physician. With this aid, the patient will better be able to meet and satisfy the new needs and impulses which are released by the analysis, but which from force of circumstance the outer world must in part deny. In this Jungian method, the physician must play two quite distinctive roles. To keep the two from interfering, so to speak, neutralizing each other, is one of the fine problems of psychoanalytic therapy. Among the special developments of the Freudian method is that of rank. Rank's technique is characterized by less emphasis on the reductive and causal side, for which is required an elaborate reconstruction of the life history, and a more exclusive consideration of the working out of the transference relationship. One desirable result of this modification is to shorten the duration of treatment. To repeat, one desirable result of this modification is to shorten the duration of treatment, which is still further reduced by having the physician set the termination of treatment in a sense somewhat prematurely. Rank's contention is that there is no need in a simple therapeutic analysis to prove over again for each patient the whole psychoanalytic theory by a historic reconstruction of the past. The latter has academic and research value, but according to him it means little so far as cure is concerned. He maintains that it is chiefly the dynamics of the transference situation itself that produces the desired psychological changes in the patient, and that on this point the emphasis in treatment should be concentrated. The analyst in the Rankian method takes a more active part, mainly in interpretation of the patient's productions, speech, and attitudes as they appear in the analysis, thereby translating them into their deepest unconscious meaning. By such properly timed interpretations, the subject, if he accepts, is, as it were, forced progressively from stage to stage, while in opposition he strives to maintain various regressive and infantile levels, patterns of his poorly equipped psychic organization, now newly activated in the analytic situation. By this striving he vainly hopes to find in the analysis something of a refuge and achieves a more comfortable emotional adjustment than he had been able to gain in the real world of daily living. Most of this striving and hoping goes on unconsciously and is only gradually uncovered by the analysis as it progresses. The Rankian modification of the more typical procedure in treatment demands, in particular, vigorous potentialities for normality on the part of the subject. It is not the method of choice for the psychologically weak or for those who are too greatly handicapped by circumstance. Its advantages and limitations are yet to be fully determined. Much psychotherapy of today, which is given loosely the name of psychoanalysis, comes far from conforming to the methods originated by Freud, which have been outlined in these chapters. There is no copyright on the name itself, but if it is to have any definiteness at all in the minds of clear-thinking people, and in the world of science, it can best be limited to the meaning given by the originator. Some remarks by Freud on the subject of the psychoanalytic investigation of the mind apply equally to the problem of therapy. He says, any line of investigation, no matter what its direction, which recognizes these two facts, resistance and transference, and takes them as the starting point of its work, may call itself psychoanalysis, though it arrives at results other than my own. C. Psychoanalytic treatment of the nature described in this discussion applies only to a selected group of cases, which is limited in various ways. A considerable degree of intelligence is essential. On the whole, after the first half of life, the method is not advisable. The circumstances of the patient's life must be such as to give him opportunity to gain satisfaction in normal living. Such things as hopeless poverty, failure in ambition, severe bereavement, or an unhappy but binding marriage bond may be insurmountable obstacles. People suffering from such circumstances will profit more from methods of consolation than from reconstruction. Most psychoanalytic work has been with neurotics, and little is known as yet of its influence on psychotic patients. Psychoneurotics, to be helped by psychoanalysis, must have considerable fundamental stamina of personality. Nothing is added to a man by this method, and he is given no crutches to lean on. He can profit only as he has promise of better things within himself. The obsessional neuroses, conversion hysterias, certain sexual abnormalities, and the common anxiety states offer the most favorable material for treatment by analysis. Psychoanalysis has been called the major surgery of psychotherapy. The comparison does well enough. Like major surgery, analysis does not help everything, nor is it usually the first method to be thought of in trouble. Most nervous difficulties can be helped by more simple methods. Perhaps one may say that analysis, like surgery, should be reserved for those problems which less radical procedure does not reach. The time and money involved make psychoanalysis something of a therapeutic luxury. As with private sanatoria, ocean voyages, and so on, it must necessarily be beyond the means of the majority of people. Certainly, the vast number of psychoneurotics in both clinics and private practice will have to get along without it. Other psychotherapeutic methods, suggestions, persuasion, common sense teaching, directorship, and so on, will remain the chief resources in psychotherapy. It is true, however, that psychoanalytic doctrine has deeply influenced all methods of modern psychotherapy. Perhaps the therapy of choice for the future will be some eclectic procedure, borrowing from all sources and enriched in depth by the analytic school. In prophylactic measures through general education, psychoanalysis can certainly add much to the self-understanding of the individual, which the complexity of the modern world makes increasingly desirable. Chapter 9. Illustrative material, the case of Miss A. As a supplement to the theoretical consideration of psychoanalytic treatment given in previous chapters, the presentation of some actual case histories will be of value for concrete illustration. To set forth in any clear